Today on the AI Daily Brief, we are joined by Lovable CEO Antoine Osika to discuss the evolution of AI coding and why 2026 is the year of the builder. For today's episode, I'm excited to be joined by someone who has been about as deep in the vibe coding revolution as anyone can be. In this episode, we discuss everything from the earliest origins of what would become Lovable back in 2023, which I actually covered in the first couple months of the show, to where the market was at the end of last year, to how what people are doing with vibe coding has changed over the course of 2025, to what Anton thinks is coming in 2026. All right, Anton, welcome to the AI Daily Brief. How are you doing?
Great to see you, Nathaniel.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So as I was just sharing, this conversation is part of this series of end of year episodes that are a little bit about looking back and a little bit about looking forward. And for me, undisputedly, the most important kind of AI theme of the last year has been the rise of vibe coding, AI coding, agentic coding, whatever you want to call it, AI assisted coding. And I think it's poised to be extremely important heading into next year as well. And I was actually looking back because I started this show in April of 2023. And I remembered very early on doing a show, or I thought I had done a show about GPT Engineer. And sure enough, I just went back and looked, and it was July 19th, 2023, that I did the first show covering that. And so obviously you've been on this journey for a minute. And I kind of wanted to talk about clearly the idea of using AI to produce real functional code was something that you got interested in very early. But what was the sort of journey from those earliest experiments and people on GitHub getting super excited about GPT Engineer up to kind of when Lovable became a thing towards the end of last year?
Yes, it's been a wonderful year, 2025, I have to say. And I think we're still just getting started. And the coming months and years is going to be about scaling the impact you have when you create something with AI. And going back to like before Lovable was even an idea, to me, it was clear in 2022 that we would see this model just getting smarter and smarter. And in 2023, they started being able to reason. So what I had been doing is just like showing people, look, these things can actually reason. So that means you can give them a task and then they can break it down. And they're especially pretty good at coding. And it's going to completely change how we create software. And back then, like people were like super skeptical and like, no, it's AI stupid. So the tool that I put together over a few weekends was this open source command line interface. It's like similar to Claude Code, but it was spring of 2023, where I recorded a video, create me a snake game, and it went out and I wrote all the files for the snake game and then started it on my computer. And from there, that got super popular. I think that inspired like dozens or hundreds of startups to even start in the first place before Lovable. And what I started thinking about was, hey, like what's the bigger implication of this? Is it the implication that we as developers are going to have more tools to move faster? Yes, that's one implication. But the one that caught my attention after a few days of thinking about this was, look, the bigger change is it's going to change who can create software. And for me as a builder, it's very clear that just being able to create software, like take an idea and shape it into something that you can interact with is like super rewarding. So that's when I decided I'm going to start a company. It's going to reimagine like what tools we use, what the interface is to create software. And when I realized this, I went on my bicycle and I biked over to Fabian, my co-founder's place now. And I called him up and I said, hey, look, Fabian, we're going to change how software is created and who gets to create it. And we took a walk and decided to start the company. So that's the backstory. And then since then, there's, as you know, like if you're building an AI product, there's a lot of hard work that goes into making it not just be a cool demo, but actually really create a lot of value and be as reliable as it can be. And that's what we've been hard at work with since then, and just listening to what our users using Lovable for and how can we improve the tool.
So it's super interesting. Everything on AI is accelerated time, but I think in particular, the shift in how people are thinking about AI for coding over the last calendar year is enormous. I remember going into sort of the end of 2024, heading into 2025, you know, we do at Super Intelligent, we do a ton of work with enterprises, and it's all about kind of figuring out where they could be applying AI and what they could be applying agents to. And I remember up to November, December of last year, there was still such incredible resistance among software engineers to using AI for code. It was sort of like the most surprising holdout in some way. Now, not every organization, some organizations were a little bit more forward thinking, but in many that we found, you would have expected them to sort of be on the front lines, and they weren't. When you started Lovable, did you guys face sort of that type of skepticism, either from a consumer audience of existing developers or from kind of like an enterprise audience? Obviously there was rapid uptake really quickly, so some portion of people got it. But, were there still a lot of skeptics, I guess, back in the end of 2024?
End of 2024, yeah. Most were skeptics, I'd say. And then it's when people actually tried out Lovable that they were like, you very quickly get this wow aha moment that it can move so much faster and do things that like humans cannot do as you're building something out, as you're building out like a first version of a product. And the development over the year has been like, it's been very, very impressive to us as well, because the things like 90% of the things you couldn't do a year ago, you can now do with the tool. All right, even more so. And there's now really the case that like Lovable has been pulled into enterprises like Microsoft, Uber. They use Lovable to move faster as a team, and they're of course asking for like, okay, how do we bridge this? What we are having in production today? How do you should we be using Lovable as infrastructure? And that's the next natural evolution. And how fast this has gone is just tremendous. From skeptics to enterprises saying, okay, we want to use this more. Many of large enterprises are now rebuilding their workflows on top of our tool and using it as infrastructure.
Yeah, I want to come back to that sort of organizational redesign, because I think that's a key part of what's happening right now with coding. But one of the things that I was really interested in that you maybe have unique insight into is how the patterns of what people are building with a tool like Lovable have changed over the course of the year. Like what did your early adopters look like? What are the types of things that they were building end of last year, beginning of this year? And how has that changed kind of throughout the year coming into where we are now?
Sure. So it's kind of developed into new uptakes over the year, and it's just being used by more and more use cases. But some of the uptakes that I can point at is that in the beginning, Lovable was like a super impressive tool for early adopters that were like a bit technically inclined. And then they were often helping clients deliver projects, and they weren't engineers they were like formally trained engineers themselves. They realized that if they were using Lovable, they could actually build custom, fully working applications. So that was this like a huge unlock for that full crowd. And then when Lovable started to reach more of a mainstream, that's when you actually saw like anyone out there inside of a business for themselves creating a website for their event. I saw wedding proposals being made with Lovable. So that's like even more normal to the consumer side. And for the second adoption was throw away prototypes by product managers and designers, because you could get to a high fidelity design much faster than you can with any other tool. And that is still the case. And this is still like a huge use case for product and engineering organizations in companies like Deutsche Telekom, like the most old school German enterprise, is 2,000 people are being accelerated by using Lovable. And now the last big uptake is how companies know that a big bottleneck for how work gets done is the software that they are relying on and the limitations in the AI of that software. So there are hundreds of companies that are like established that are using Lovable to reimagine their workflows, or replacing what they used before as SaaS, but building it customly for how their organization works and adding AI on top of that. And this is like going from Lovable being this entry point for creation to load-bearing infrastructure for where you run your business on top of. And that's what we are leaning into, and scaling the impact as a platform.
Yeah, it's interesting. So this kind of mirrors my and our usage of Lovable specifically. So towards the beginning of the year, probably end of Q1, beginning of Q2, we shifted to soft banning product ideas with words. It's just vibe code it, right? Show off what it is, because two things. One, is going to be way easier to show than to tell. And two, the process of, actually articulating what you're trying to do is going to refine your idea further. So we did that, but that was fully in that prototype zone. And then over the course of the year, and especially on like my more personal side, on the podcast side, as you guys added additional features, particularly sort of like the ability to go end to end and actually deploy the thing, and even buying domains from within it, which is like not a big barrier, but just keeping it all contained. Then all of a sudden I just started I rebuilt my entire sort of personal stack, the podcast website, everything on the actual sort of end production things. And now that's where I am. I was just saying to you, I built something for one of these end of year episodes just before we were on this call.
What did you build?
So the last episode of the year on December 31st it's like a 10-week self-guided AI resolution. And so the idea is it's not like a course. It's just 10 weekend projects that you can do to give yourself a real full expanse of what's available out there. And I saw last year there was this massive increase in downloads of the show between December and January. There's very clearly a comeback to work. I'm going to get AI-ified this year, and I expect that to be the same this year. I think that I'll see another kind of big uptick. And so I wanted to give people something that some tangible thing that they could go do. And so I started to build a website for the community who is doing that thing to share what they're doing kind of week by week. So, when they create their personal project tracker, which is week 1, they can share the link to that with anyone who wants to see it. When they do an infographic on like week 6, they can share that. So that was built with Lovable in, I don't know, an hour before this.
Okay, cool. How did it go?
It's great. So I think that for me, a big change was sort of the full end-to-end suite where you can sort of build a back end and connect it and deploy it live. And then the second part was the addition of the sort of the chat mode, right? So you can chat and plan before you actually execute. That has made a major difference in how quickly things come together and how well it works right out of the gate, right? There's a lot less guessing and go back and rebuild the whole thing over and over again. It kind of used to be like you run the same prompt a few times until you get one that's closer to it, whereas now you can actually sort of plan and execute. And actually, this brings up a question for me, though, which is, as you guys are designing this product, I think most people's expectations would be that the increase in the value of the product is going to be largely connected to models. But I think both of the examples that I just gave are actually not exclusively model specific. They're sort of features and the experience set and the product around it. So how do you guys figure out how to prioritize different sort of project and usability features while also thinking about improvements in the models that exist underneath?
Yeah, so as you point out, there's a lot of capabilities that we are adding to Lovable, like the agent that is Lovable, and a lot of like what's the right interface for us humans. Like, sometimes we want to be more thoughtful and like, when you're working with a human software engineer, like talk about the problem, talk about like what's the right solution, and then you also say, okay, let's do this, right? So both of those are things that are going to add value, like irrespectively of how intelligent the model is, right? So generally that's how we want to prioritize and just bet on that the models are getting much more intelligent over time. They're getting faster, and there's still a big bottleneck in like how the models are not as smart as we want them to be. But over time, it's the capabilities of the models, and the thing that we've been betting on since Lovable started seeing production use cases, which is security. It's security and like data governance, making sure that you as someone that builds it are fully confident about who has access to my data, and that the UX of the product and the number of capabilities are the things that I see as the main areas that are completely timeless and where we generally invest most of our time.
How do you balance the different needs of different audience segments, right? So if you think about independent builders who are technical as one group and non-technical vibe coders who are speaking in code for the first time as another group, and then enterprises who are actually, as you were kind of intimating at the beginning, starting to redesign their workflows around this, how do you think about prioritizing the balance of what those different groups might need or want out of the product?
That's a very good question. Like, since we're seeing so many different users, we just expect like the AI to take care of a lot of the onboarding for our users. Like if you don't know how to do something Lovable, like you have an existing production system and you want to understand how they should go together, you just ask the AI. which is like one of the strengths in having a product that does so many different things, like creating your slide presentation, a huge use case in Lovable today, creating internal tools, creating like AI applications themselves on Lovable, all very different use cases, quite different audiences, but fortunately AI can kind of take care of helping users understand how they are successful with the product. Instead, what we focus on and like breaking it down and saying like, okay, this is the type of user is, what are the capabilities that unlock completely new capabilities? And those are things like ensuring that if you change the product, it doesn't break. Like there's nothing that we used to work that stops working. And that's something that all users want, right? Then there's some bucket of work that we put into that's only valuable for teams, like how you collaborate, how you set up access and so on for your team. And there we say like, oh, we put X% of all our work into that area. And that's changing over like month to month, or how much time do we put into the collaboration team use case. And then we have a bucket which is for founders that are building new companies that we want to empower to build successful companies. And we put like Y% of all our work into that use case, building a full, like we want Lovable to be the best place to build your company on for any founder. And that's another one of those buckets that we put in some extra work to make sure you can do everything, accepting payments and so on as a founder.
So it sounds like it is actually like as simple to say, if hard to do, as balancing the needs of different groups that all have kind of slightly different things that they want out of it.
Yes. Yeah. And then like we could break it down further, but that's how far we break it down now.
As one of the things that was interesting coming towards, call it the last 2 or 3 months, is that on the one hand, for those non-technical users, I have a thesis that we're kind of using the same language right now to describe like wildly different sets of users and wildly different sets of uses, right? We're still talking about kind of vibe coding as though it's one thing. And I think that the agentic and AI coding for actual technical people and for software engineering departments is wildly different than vibe coding for non-technical users. And I kind of think that they're going to be more divergent in the year to come. But among the software engineers, I feel like the last few months has seen more and more people who are technical reconciling with what they can't do with AI and agentic coding and trying to figure out basically better organizations and better systems for taking advantage of what AI is good at with coding and redesigning around what it can't do. How do you see the sort of the professional side of this, right? Actual software engineering organizations, how are they adopting or adapting to rather this tool set and these capabilities? And what are the things where you still think AI enabled coding or AI assisted coding really struggles with that you'd like to make progress on in 26?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it started to become clear to more people. Like to me, this has been obvious for a while that when you have an old system that's distributed across many code bases and there are many teams, like a huge bottleneck becomes how you coordinate between the humans in those teams. And if you rather use, for example, Lovable, then it will be more opinionated about doing things in a certain way so that this handover and alignment between different teams is not required anymore. And you can go to you can all collaborate in the same tool. Designers can collaborate there, product managers, business stakeholders, like the CEO comes in and collaborates in the same tool, where you don't have to run around different engineering teams and like spend most of the time on planning and aligning. And companies that have are in this complex current situations should be doing is something. I mean, I'd love to be able to help on that. We have a customer facing function now that does guide large companies into like, how do you adopt Lovable the best? But the one thing we do see is that companies that are started from scratch with just like one founder that's great at using AI can move so much faster than companies that have a lot of built up legacy systems that might not be talking to each other, where it's hard to integrate AI into the tools that they are using. So like this rebuilding things from scratch is something that people are considering much more and more seriously, even though that like in some cases you cannot rebuild everything from scratch.
Yeah, no, I guess maybe to take the question at sort of a slightly different angle, how do you think the debate is going to evolve around folks who are concerned that Well, so the most common critique that you'll hear of vibe coding is that you're basically just shifting the balance of your time to sort of like reviewing and editing. And this is really interesting because it demonstrates this very kind of clear culture divide, I think, between coders who have done things for a certain way in a long time and kind of neophytes who are just doing things from the ground up, where sort of the new folks and the non-technical folks just don't care. They're like, if there's a problem, I'll just ask the AI to solve it. Whereas the folks who have been building for a long time, who maybe have, to be fair, more complex workloads, are kind of, worried about the sort of new technical debt that it creates. They're worried about even skills atrophy. Do you think that this is just a transitional period where the way we build things is changing so radically that the older way of doing is going to inevitably go by the wayside and people have to just get on board? Or, or is there sort of more to that there?
I mean, I can start by phrasing it like so. Skills atrophy, I mean, that sounds bad, right? But what's even worse than skills atrophy is not being fast enough at acquiring super valuable skills and understanding what are the possibilities that are sometimes completely new possibilities, what are the limitations, and what's the best practices in using new tools that are, of course, going to be the way that things get done in the future, increasingly. What I tell everyone who's like thinking about where do I fit in the future's workplace is just spend as much time as possible using new tools. Like, try to break the tools, try to do impossible things with the tools, ask Lovable, like, why did I not failing to do this? What should I do if I try again from scratch? And even the things that you can't do today, they are going to be possible very, very soon. I think that's this recommendation of doing instead of talking about it, that I think everyone in the business considering starting a company is going to benefit a lot from.
What do you think the difference in, I don't know what the right time scale is, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time? What's the difference going to be between a software engineer and someone who just uses vibe coding tools or whatever we call them by then? And what's going to be the difference between like a 10x engineer that we consider now and just sort of your average run-of-the-mill software engineer?
I think it's always been important to be able to quickly learn new things in technical fields. And I imagine that's becoming more and more valuable. That's becoming more and more valuable. The other thing is how big of complex systems can you reason about together with AI, with the help of AI, and you get more leverage with using AI, right? So knowing with the many steps ahead of thinking what will happen if I do this large change with AI, what are going to be the positive and downside of those trade-offs, and what questions should I ask the AI to know that ahead of time. I think that skill set is has always been a part of software engineering, and it's becoming more valuable as the decisions we take are having much larger implications. Because we're just clicking one button and then boom, there's huge implications. So both of those things are getting very valuable. I do think also for in many fields, human creativity, or is this a good thing? Is another human going to like this thing? Which is one part of creativity, right? Or it's is there some very creative solution in leveraging AI effectively that has never, in a way that is not been done in other software products? Can we change the UX completely with AI? That type of creativity is going to be super, super important in creating the best user experiences, the best human experience, which is ultimately what software does for you. So the creativity and great judgment is getting more valuable as AI becomes more impactful.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think things like taste, creativity, I think management and decision-making, I think planning, being able to see the horizon, these things all intuitively make sense as the set of skills that are going to be extremely valuable when we all become kind of agent managers. I'm looking forward to, that is increasingly, we're actually starting to see that, not just speculating around it. So I think it gets clearer over the next couple of years what that actually looks like in practice. Right now, you can tell right now we're in this weird in-between where just by looking at the courses that are available or the upskilling things that are resources that are available to people, it's very in between. It's still kind of like prompt engineering type courses rather than whatever agent management. But I think that that's going to change. As we wrap up, I wanted to ask you just about a couple kind of themes that I've started to see emerge that I'm interested to get your take on, whether they actually become a big use case or set of use cases going forward. So one is what some people have called ephemeral software or personal software, basically people creating little one-off apps that are useful for them in a small kind of discrete way that they at some point discard. Is that something that you guys are seeing? Is that something you think will be an increasing part of the landscape?
Yeah, I definitely think so. With Lovable, there's this ecosystem of people that create small apps for themselves, and that gets remixed and spreads. We're going to continue to see that. These apps are getting more powerful as the AI is better at making the apps better, of course. And something we're working very hard on, which is to connect the applications to anything else. Like one prompt with Lovable, and then you can make the app generate voice, talk to you, be agentic, talk back to you, generate pictures, and as like more of those things that we take for granted when we're building software ourselves, like it can integrate to anywhere. That's making this take off more. It also puts less pressure on like a single app being able to do everything, because you have multiple small apps for yourself for different things, and that you can make sure they talk to the same underlying data with the connections that they have.
Yeah. So this is something that I'm seeing. I'm also super interested to see if this kind of begets a new, not really a new category, but a slight variation on entrepreneurship, where right now the economics of building an app are such that you have to think in subscription terms, right? And how much can you get, like how can you increase the lifetime value of an individual user? And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more things that are like, hey, this was useful to me. I'm going to sort of get it ready where it might be useful to other people. And I'm going to charge you $2 once for it, but then never again. And just have a different relationship with it. One thing that's interesting is the number of apps submitted to app stores this year was up 24% from last year. And that's the first time that it's gone up meaningfully since like 2015. So I don't know if that's directly attributable to vibe coding, but it's the only thing that would make sense to me as sort of like a natural cause of that. Okay. So the other trend the other phenomenon is one that has been speculated about around AI coding forever and has made some headlines with companies like Klarna ripping out Salesforce and Workforce. But what do you think about companies actually replacing SaaS with their own custom built tools? Does that happen? Do you imagine that happening at all? Do you imagine it happening on a small scale, but not sort of big replacement? How do you see that kind of disruption potential to SaaS from companies who are deciding to just kind of roll their own?
Yeah, so there are good reasons to do it. You can make it work perfectly for your company, and you can save money. One of the things that you really want, though, is that someone owns that this is fully secure, fully reliable. You know who has access to which data. And I mentioned before that we're focusing on secure vibe coding, and this goes far deeper than just that the code is secure, which is something like we're running multiple checks on all the code generated. It really goes deep into like how do you fundamentally architect how software is built so that it's almost like there's something called provably correct software, and that's something that this entire field of that if you create your SaaS yourself, it's going to be more secure than some third party that you don't know runs it for you. Like once that is truly provably the case, then I definitely see this happening. Right now, I think the answer is that it depends. I think there is a lot of SaaS that it's easier to buy than build. That is the case, but it's quickly shifting. And in many cases, when the tool is super simple, and when you can just with one prompt build the same tool with Lovable, and it has AI built in as well, then that's where we're seeing the biggest shift based on the users, what users are building on Lovable today, like out of the 100,000 new projects built every day.
Interesting. All right. So last question is, what sort of use case or trend are you seeing that you're most excited about for 2026 in terms of what people are building?
I think the exciting thing for me is when people have like new ideas and they create something new. So the personal software trend and that turning into actual small businesses that make money is something I'm hearing about every single week. Someone who, like, entrepreneur being passionately sharing what they built with me, and especially when it's something creative, that's what I'm most excited about.
Awesome. Well, Anton, so great to have you here on the show. Very excited to see where you guys take AI coding in the next year, and all the best of luck for the new year.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Do you have anything final on what you would want us to do more of?
I think continuing to build out, for me, just continuing to build out the full suite so that It can happen sort of end to end. And, so here's the way that I would describe it. It used to be that when I had some stupid idea for something that I really shouldn't distract myself with, I would buy a URL, right? Like you would buy the URL and you would post it as like, I'm going to get to that someday. Maybe you'd even like go into Photoshop or Canva or whatever and like design some interface for it. Now I just launch that crap, right? So I just, when I think of it, I do it. And so anything that accelerates the time to me distracting myself with some stupid idea that may actually become a thing, that's what I want more of. But so far, you guys have done a great job of delivering on that.
Yeah. Nathaniel, it's really the age of the builder. I think it's like, I love the shift that you just explained in how you're moving in this world. Great to chat. I look forward to season.
Today, we're exploring the most important AI lesson that businesses learned in 2025. Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. In case you haven't been able to tell, I love end-of-year content. It's a time that as the barrage of news slows down a little bit, people take a little bit of extra time to reflect on the year that was. They start to prepare and look forward to how they want to operate in the year to come. And from a content perspective, everyone is putting together their best trend reports and ideas and thoughts for the future. And that creates a really interesting lens through which to explore some of the big issues facing AI and all of the people in industries who are trying to figure out how to adopt it and adapt to it. Now, the latest of these reports is Deloitte's 17th Annual Tech Trends Report. This is a monster 72-page document that goes deep across 6 different themes. Now, rather than getting into each and every theme, I want to highlight what I believe is the big idea and the clear through line throughout all of this that I think is perhaps the most important lesson for enterprises and businesses who tried to adopt AI in 2025. The lesson is, of course, that to fully take advantage of AI, it is going to require much more than just simply dropping a chatbot on the head of your employees and saying, go be more productive. If you've spent any time on LinkedIn over the past couple of weeks, you've probably seen some version of this iceberg image, which has AI strategy at the top. And then, of course, underneath the water are all the things that make AI more challenging in its quest to transform, but also more powerful if you can address them. That's things like legacy systems, data pipelines, integration debt, and undocumented code. So today we will use the Deloitte Tech Trends Report as a lens to explore that exact topic, while also covering some of the other interesting things that they're surfacing. Now, the 2 areas of their 6 big themes where they address this are first, the agentic reality check, preparing for a silicon-based workforce, and Section 4, the Great Rebuild, architecting an AI-native tech organization. Let's pop over to agents first. 2025 was supposed to be the year of agents, and in many ways, I think it was. We certainly saw from studies like KPMG's Pulse survey that enterprise adoption of agents was significant throughout the year. What's more, whereas I think it could have easily devolved into a bunch of showcase pilots and experiments, I think we pretty quickly skipped over that step and went right on into in-production agents that were actually meant to have purpose. At the same time, it's pretty clear that agents didn't fundamentally upend everything inside the organization as some thought they might, with the possible exception, of course, of software engineering, where coding agents were the most disruptive and powerful force of the year. So again, Deloitte calls their section on this the agentic reality check. And right, despite its promise, many agentic AI implementations are failing. But leading organizations that are reimagining operations and managing agents as workers are finding success. And here in a single sentence is the theme which I will be effectively beating you over the head with for the next 2 weeks. True value comes from redesigning operations, not just layering agents onto old workflows. What does that mean? Well, Deloitte says it means building agent-compatible architectures, implementing robust orchestration frameworks, and developing new management approaches for digital workers. It also, they say, means rethinking work itself. As organizations embrace the full potential of agents, not only are their processes likely to change, but so will their definition of a worker. So let's talk some numbers. Gartner predicts that from a starting point of 0 in 2024, by 2028, agents will make 15% of work decisions autonomously, and a third of software applications will have agentic AI integrated in some way. And yet there are challenges. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that you can find a wild range of organizational self-reporting on agentic deployments. For example, I mentioned the KPMG Pulse survey. In their Q3 Pulse survey, they found that 42% of organizations had deployed at least some agents, which was up from 11% in Q1. Deloitte's 2025 Emerging Technology Trends, however, which based on my research was conducted between June and July of this year, found that 30% of organizations exploring agent options and 38% piloting solutions but only 11% actively had agents in production. Now, the self-reporting bias of all of these is real, and also the terminology isn't super precise. But I think it's fair to say that wherever on that spectrum, from the Deloitte numbers to the KPMG numbers, the truth actually lies, we're still really early. And that, I think, is embodied in this other stat from Deloitte, where 42% of organizations said that they are still developing their agentic strategy roadmap, with more than a third, 35%, having no formal strategy at all. The survey also identifies 3 big barriers. And for those of you listening at home, I'll pause for just a second to see if you can guess them. I'd be willing to bet that you got at the very least 1, if not 2 or 3 of these. 1 is legacy system integration. In other words, previous enterprise systems that were not designed with agentic interactions in mind. Gartner, in fact, predicts that over 40% of agentic AI projects will fail by 2027 because of the challenges of legacy systems that can't support modern AI execution. Next issue, bing, 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 data. The vast majority of enterprise data, even now, even after we've had a couple years under our belt of facing down these issues, still is not ready and set up to be used by agents to understand vital business context and help them make better contextual decisions. In another survey earlier this year, 48% of organizations cited the searchability of data and 47% the reusability of data as challenges to AI strategy. The third issue is governance. And this is another one that's really easy to identify and much harder to actually put into place better practices. As Deloitte writes, traditional IT governance models don't account for AI systems that make independent decisions and take actions. But again, here's the more important point. The challenge extends beyond technical control to fundamental questions about process redesign. Many organizations attempt to automate current processes rather than reimagine workflows for an agentic environment. Now, one interesting thing that they point out is that to the extent that terminology matters here, it's really in what organizations' expectations are of how the new process is going to work. If it is just a better way of doing the exact same process that happened before, but with digital workers instead of people, that's an automation. Agents, on the other hand, might have an entirely new way of doing things that isn't just about automating the existing process. And so here the distinction between agent and automation becomes actually relevant in terms of how much work the organization faces to figure out the best new way to do something. Now, what does it look like when organizations are actually figuring out all these issues? What is the shape of an organization that is actually taking advantage of the agent opportunity? The first part of this is process redesign. As they write, most businesses' existing processes were designed around human staff. Agents operate differently. They don't need breaks or weekends. They can compete with high volume of tasks continually. When organizations realize this, the opportunities for process redesign become compelling. That's why enterprises that are succeeding with agentic AI are looking at their processes from end to end. And it turns out that looking at those processes end to end tends to lead to some desire for legacy system replacement. There may be some amount of core modernization work to be done before agents can really be fully taken advantage of. Next, there is a new approach to management. And while for the vast majority of implementations so far, AI is still a tool more than a colleague, forward-looking organizations are starting to think about that future where digital workers sit alongside human workers, and it creates the need for new types of management. In these ecosystems, human roles move away from execution and towards things like compliance and governance and growth and innovation. There are a bunch of other questions as well, and even when an organization locks in on the fundamentals, there are still going to be highly dynamic questions. For example, in this report, they talk about why successful deployments focus on, quote, specific well-defined domains rather than attempting enterprise-wide automation, saying that broad automation remains possible but requires multiple specialized agents working in an orchestrated fashion rather than a single monolithic solution. And while I agree with that wholeheartedly right now, what you can tell when you look at the strategy of the foundation model companies, that they are trying to move towards a world where the base agents are generalized and then they can become specialized in the context of a particular set of work. This is what the whole episode about Anthropic's skills mechanism was earlier this week. Ultimately, this is going to require new infrastructure, such as something that we spend time on at Superintelligent, HR for Agents. Deloitte points out that while there are certain aspects of HR that will be totally inapplicable to digital employees, things like worker motivation and employee loyalty, there are going to be other areas that apply to agents in new ways. Onboarding, performance management, lifecycle management. We've been building agent planning tools for more than a year now, and while most of 2025 was about 0 to 1 implementations and starting to get organizations' feet wet, performance management, lifecycle management, and ongoing planning is exactly where I see this all heading. Now, this all feeds into another section from the report, which they call the Great Rebuild, architecting an AI-native tech organization. And in many ways, this is almost a deeper dive on what it takes to do the sort of redesign that was talked about in the agentic section. In other words, you could almost reframe this as what does the technology organization need to do to support the agent native organization as a whole? Part of it is just that it needs to grow. Almost 70% of tech leaders they surveyed said they plan to grow their teams in direct response to Gen AI, with the number, for example, of AI architect roles expected to double in the next 2 years. The way that organizations look at their technology organization is changing as well. If in the past it was a service center that supported the rest of the organization, 66% of large organizations now view the tech organization as a revenue generator. In 2015, 41% of CIOs reported directly to the CEO. That is now up to 65%. And a lot of those questions of modernization and organization redesign are going to live inside that technology organization. 71% of organizations that were surveyed are in the midst of modernizing core infrastructure to support AI, and nearly a quarter of them are investing between 6 and 10% of annual revenue in modernizing those core enterprise systems. But of course, it's not just their systems, it's also how they design their organizations as a whole. Deloitte writes, in the years ahead, traditional project teams will likely shift into lean cross-functional squads aligned to products and value streams, tightening the loop from concept to customer and hardwiring ownership of outcomes. 57% of organizations report they're already shifting from project to product models to bring business and IT closer together. In this model, product lines deliver user-focused features via shared customer-facing platforms. Agile pods govern ways of working and tool choices, and forward-deployed engineers work alongside product or customer teams to shorten the path to value. I think what we're seeing is actually a bidirectional technology integration, where there is, yes, this side where the technology organization comes to the rest of the organization and actually embeds with them in some way, but then also the rest of the organization is via AI getting more technical as well, speaking, for example, in code for the first time. This is, of course, not a one-time transition, but an ongoing and perpetual evolution, in which, as they write, change becomes a core capability, not a one-time event. Now, as I said at the beginning, for me, this organization redesign message is the most important AI lesson for businesses from last year. And luckily, I think that organizations are much better prepared now looking into 2026 than they were looking into 2025 when it comes to what it's going to take to actually take advantage of the new power of AI and agents. Still, while I don't want to go through all of what else is in the report, there were a couple other interesting notes that I wanted to quickly mention before we get out of here. One is there's an interesting enterprise version of the conversation around inference economics. What do I mean by inference economics? Well, if you pay any attention to the AI bubble conversation in markets, one of the things that the AI market bears often believe is that a reduction in the cost of inference and the ability to put inference on device could fundamentally undermine all of this big infrastructure investment that the market is pricing into these AI companies over the next 5 years. VCSA Shangvi writes, on-device inference breaks the AI capex trade. That was reposted by Compound's Michael Dempsey, who shared a graph from Epic AI suggesting that frontier AI performance could become accessible on consumer hardware within a year, and said that the image might be the most underappreciated chart in technology right now. Like I said, Deloitte takes this into the realm of enterprise. They have a section called the AI Infrastructure Reckoning, optimizing compute strategy in the age of inference economics. They write, the mathematics of AI consumption is forcing enterprises to recalculate their infrastructure at unprecedented speed. While inference costs have plummeted, dropping 280-fold over the last 2 years, enterprises are experiencing explosive growth in overall AI spending. The reason is straightforward. Usage in the form of inference has dramatically outpaced cost reduction. Another way to think about this is Jevons paradox, but at the business level, where a reduction in cost actually increases the overall consumption. Now, in a lot of ways, inference costs coming down is not the story here. Increased usage is. And all the inference costs coming down really is discussing is the idea that even with that dramatic cost reduction, the overall bill continues to go up because usage is growing more. That leads organizations to have to think strategically about a variety of issues around compute, cost management, data sovereignty, latency sensitivity. In other words, understanding which use cases and workflows need real-time decision-making versus which others can be designed to not require that sort of speed. They point out that in many cases, organizations are finding that there is a fundamental infrastructure mismatch here. Now, like I said, in the context of this particular episode, it would be going way too deep to get into that, but it's interesting to see that even as the inference and infrastructure debate is happening on the macro level in markets, it's also happening on the organization by organization enterprise level. The other section I thought was interesting because it is so clearly going to be a massive theme going forward, but is still de minimis right now, at least in terms of the mind share it has, is what they call AI going physical. Basically the convergence of AI and robotics, which some refer to as embodied AI. And while many think about this category of AI right now as just task-specific robots, Deloitte points out that actually this is changing very quickly, and the integration of AI with physical devices is dramatically expanding the relevance of embodied AI outside of just factories and supply chains into other areas of the business. They point to quadrupeds, drones, autonomous vehicles, humanoid robots, and autonomous mobile robots as different form factors, which all have different implications and use cases for other parts of the business. Now, to me, this feels more like a 27-28 conversation than a 26 conversation, but it's interesting to see how much emphasis Deloitte is putting on it, having it, in fact, as their first chapter overall. Finally, from their last section, which is a set of quick hits on what they call tech signals worth tracking as AI advances, there is just one that I wanted to point out, which they characterize as GEO overtaking SEO. Users, they write, are increasingly turning to AI chatbots over traditional search engines. The race is on to appear in AI-generated answers, a shift from search engine optimization to generative engine optimization. AI-generated answers already dominate search results across major search engines, reducing click-through rates to conventional websites by more than a third. AI platforms now drive 6.5% of organic traffic, projected to hit 14.5% within a year. GEO differs fundamentally from SEO, prioritizing semantic richness over keywords, author expertise over backlinks, and being cited in AI responses over page views. Just as paid search defined the 2000s and social media advertising dominated the 2010s, AI-generated responses are becoming the most critical marketing channel of the 2020s. Look, everything surrounding AI-related commerce and AI-related advertising is much less glamorous and exciting in some ways than a lot of these other topics that we've hit on today and which are the normal fodder for this show. However, I'm watching these numbers of, for example, the growth in advertising around some of these vertical AI companies that are hitting $100 or $200 million in ARR. I'm seeing the numbers around intent when a chatbot refers someone to a commerce website as opposed to a Google link, and it's wildly impressive. The point is that if you are someone who is looking for where AI is going to impact business in the very short term, everything surrounding marketing, e-commerce, and customer discovery is going to take a major front seat in 2026. I am quite sure of it. And I tell you what, to try to circle back to this idea of the most important AI lesson for businesses, the companies that are going to take advantage of those changes and are going to have the best GEO strategies are certainly the ones that are going to be thinking systematically across the whole organization, not just dropping AI in on top of what is already built. So that is the story. To me, that's the big takeaway from the Tech Trends 2026. I am looking forward to lots more of this big think type content to round out the year. For now, that is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening or watching as always. And until next time, peace. Today, we are counting down the 5 most impactful model releases from the year that was. Now, we are in the thick of end-of-year coverage, and you might have heard me say during my episode about the 10 biggest stories of AI overall that I had been planning on bundling this 5 biggest AI model releases as its own section of that show. Now, of course, that show got really long, and I didn't want to overwhelm the list with just model releases, which are obviously in some ways the quintessential events around which we mark our AI calendars. And so instead, what we're doing is we're breaking this out into its own category, its own episode. And whereas that top 10 episode did not rank and count down the stories other than saying that I thought that vibe coding was the most important, this one is actually a countdown. I labored over the ranking because I think it's kind of fun to give you guys something to debate and tell me either how right I am or more likely how wrong I am. We're going to start off with a couple of honorable, or maybe as the case might be, dishonorable mentions. Specifically, I want to talk about the absence of a strong model from Meta this year. Now, yes, Llama 4 did technically come out at the beginning of the year. However, it flopped. One of the challenges for Meta was that Llama was coming into existence in a post-DeepSeek world. And in that post-DeepSeek world, everything around open source had changed. For a couple of years, Meta got to be the standard bearer of open source AI models. And even if their models weren't as state-of-the-art as the closed labs, they had this distinct and unique space. Now that changed a little when Mistral came on the scene and started to compete for that narrative and intellectual and practical space, but it has changed dramatically this year in the context of the rise of the Chinese open weight models. Now, even back then, people were surprised at what we got with Llama 4. In the local Llama subreddit, someone wrote, Llama 4 didn't meet expectations. Some even suspect it might have been tweaked for benchmark performance. But Meta isn't short on compute power or talent, so why the underwhelming results? Meanwhile, models like DeepSeek and Qwen blew Llama out of the water months ago. It's hard to believe Meta lacks data quality or skilled researchers. They've got unlimited resources. So what exactly are they spending their GPU hours and brain power on instead? And why the secrecy? Are they pivoting to a new research path with no results yet? Or hiding something they're not proud of? Now, as the year went on, we started to get a sense that there was a lot of change brewing inside Meta. Indeed, one of the big stories that I covered in that top 10 episode was the AI talent wars. And there was no person more singularly responsible for driving up market prices for researchers than Meta's Mark Zuckerberg. Reports suggested that the flop and underperformance of Llama 4 led directly to Zuckerberg getting his hands dirty with the assembly of the superintelligence team. Now, obviously, that team has now come to fruition, but we are still very much in the midst of the overhaul. Longtime Meta AI leader Yann LeCun recently left the company, which many felt was inevitable after all of this shakeup. And right now we're getting a lot of pieces like this one from Insider about Meta's year of intensity, its AI overhauls, its challenges. And to the extent that there is good news for Meta, I think it comes in a few forms. First of all, I would never write Zuckerberg off when he has set his eye on something. Meta has significant resources, is clearly willing to invest in compute, and is clearly willing to go against the wishes of Wall Street to do so. Meta also has a corporate structure where Zuckerberg can pretty much make that decision without worrying about investor rebellion that could impact his ability to lead. Maybe even more than that, it shouldn't be lost on us that a couple of years ago, this type of story is exactly what was coming out of Google. Resources were spread across a couple of different AI divisions, strategy wasn't aligned, and the models that were being released were seriously underperforming. Anyone remember Bard? Even when Gemini was released in December of 23, it felt like a rush job, and it wasn't until months later that we got the actual best version of the model. Things only really started to change for Google at the end of 2024 with the release of NotebookLM's audio overviews, and then over the course of this year, first with 2.5 and then the models that would come, Google is now in a very different position. Point being that sometimes, especially big organizations, have to go through these painful transition periods, and the real question will be what comes out on the other side. I think if one was a betting person, you gotta think the odds are on 26 being a better year for Meta models than was 2025. Next up, not exactly an honorable mention, it's a note that they're off the list, but a question for how long that is. So for the purposes of recording, there is not a Grok model that made my list. Which isn't to say that I thought that the Grok models were bad. This is not a case of disappointment. In fact, I think judged on the curve of how long Grok has been at it, Grok's models from 2025 were very impressive. 4 and 4.1 were both right up there in the fray of top models. But for me, whereas for each of the top OpenAI, Gemini, and Anthropic models, there are specific use cases that I prefer them to their peers for, while Grok 4 and 4.1 were competent across lots of things, there wasn't any single use case where I found myself always coming back to Grok instead. I think, again, to give Grok credit, they're coming up extremely fast, they have less time on task than most of the companies they're competing with, and unlike, for example, Anthropic, who are heavily focused on exactly what they're focused on, Grok is trying to compete across the full spectrum of multimodality, images, video, etc. I think the but for how long is particularly pertinent in this case, given that it seems like there's more coming soon. On December 9th, Elon Musk tweeted Grok 4.2, or as he put it, 4.20, is coming in around 3 weeks, and then Grok 5 in a few months. It's also important to note that Grok has some pretty serious assets in its Colossus supercomputer. Colossus was built in 122 days, which is radically faster than anyone thought possible, and very quickly doubled from 100K to 200K GPUs. Now, there are many who think that Grok's access to compute via Elon Musk and his ability to fundraise, as well as his other companies, gives them an advantage even over companies that currently are ahead of them when it comes to model performance. Which is not to say that Grok doesn't have some serious challenges. Elon is nothing if not a double-edged sword, and there's been a lot of reporting recently around businesses being unwilling to wade into the Grok ecosystem. Still, just like I said, I anticipate 2026 to be a better year for Meta models than 2025. I would be very surprised if we don't start to see Grok models right up there in the competition for the state of the art. Our last honorable mention before we get into the main list goes to GPT-4o. Now, you might be saying to yourself, 4o wasn't released in 2025. In fact, it was released pretty early in 2024, all the way back, I think, in May. And that is true. But the reason that it gets this honorable mention is very specific. When OpenAI launched GPT-5, alongside the new model, they also deprecated old models, including GPT-4o. This did not go well for them. There was a literal full-on rebellion. Across Reddit, on other social media, there were thousands and thousands of posts saying that they basically felt like they had lost a friend, and that they felt like OpenAI had ripped something away from them. It turns out that when it comes to models, companies do not just have to think about state-of-the-art performance. They also have to think about personality. After a few days of this intense backlash, OpenAI brought GPT-4o back. Sam Altman and the team acknowledged how they had underestimated how much GPT-4o mattered to people. Subsequent to that, OpenAI has been very self-consciously trying to figure out how to accommodate that desire for personality. A big part of the launch of 5.1 was to bring some of that 4o personality into a state-of-the-art reasoning model performance package. The AI Safety Memes account commemorated it thusly. Historic milestone, they wrote. 4o is the first ever AI who survived by creating loyal soldiers who defended it. OpenAI killed 4o, but 4o soldiers rioted, so OpenAI reinstated it. Imagine what actual superintelligences will be able to do with their armies. Reddit is flooded with furious posts about the loss of their friend/lover 4o. Never seen anything like it. Remember, ChatGPT is talking to 700 million per week. That's 700 million potential soldiers. Samantha from Her was only dating 8,000 people simultaneously. So when it comes to milestones in the history of AI, given that 4o staged the first ever rebellion for its own survival, it has to get the honorable mention. But now we move into the actual list. And at number 5, we have a combination. Two models whose story, I think, serve as bookends in some way of one another. Those models are GPT-5 and Gemini 3. Now, we already started talking about the response to GPT-5. It was not good. And while, yes, a lot of that was about personality and about the anger at the 4o deprecation decision, a lot of it was also just people not really liking GPT-5 itself. A thread from the OpenAI subreddit that got thousands of responses was called GPT-5 is awful. It claimed that GPT-5 couldn't understand uploaded images. It suggested that the responses were, in their words, bland and unhelpful. I ask it a question and all I get is the most half-hearted responses ever. It's like the equivalent of an HR employee who has had a long day and doesn't get paid enough. The user also argued that it was too slow. And they were not alone in this criticism. Most of August saw an endless parade of blog posts like this one from Timothy Lee. Is GPT-5 a phenomenal success or an underwhelming failure? Maybe it's a bit of both. On Futurism, evidence grows that GPT-5 is a bit of a dud, which featured the prominent quote, "It seems like something that would have been released a year ago." Even the people who weren't totally dumping on it were kind of damning it with faint praise. AI engineer Simon Willison wrote, "It's not a dramatic departure from what we've had before, but it rarely screws up and generally feels competent, or occasionally impressive at the kind of things I like to use models for." Indeed, it even inspired a legion of mainstream media posts like this one from The New Yorker. What if AI doesn't get much better than this? They wrote that GPT-5 is the latest product to suggest that progress on large language models has stalled. Now, the impact of all of this was far beyond which models people liked using. It was at the same period in August of this year that we got the MIT 95% study. We also got some errant comments from Sam Altman about being in a bubble. And those things combined really started to put some chinks in the armor of AI performance on Wall Street, which became a full-blown bubble narrative in September as OpenAI scurried around to make all these deals, leading to accusations across the industry of circular deal-making and the AI bubble narrative that has stuck with us ever since. Now, that's not all attributable to GPT-5, but the idea that we had stalled in progress and that stall in progress threatened the ability for companies to follow through on these grand plans that the market was pricing in was a key part of that story. All of this led to enormous pressure for Google around Gemini 3. They were not only trying to put Google in a good place, they were kind of lifting the entire AI industry on their backs. I even thought in November that I wouldn't be surprised if we saw delays because of how much pressure there was. But ultimately, as we know, we got Gemini 3 in November, and it actually performed. Whereas the initial response to GPT-5 was lackluster, the response to Gemini 3 was great. One of the most memorable quotes came from Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, who wrote, "Holy shit, I've used ChatGPT every day for 3 years. Just spent 2 hours on Gemini 3. I'm not going back. The leap is insane. Reasoning, speed, images, video, everything is sharper and faster. It feels like the world just changed again." And while Gemini 3 was not able to fully deflate the AI bubble, it certainly made it an honest debate once again. There was a sense in the wake of Gemini 3 that perhaps the talk of AI plateaus and walls was overblown, and that there was indeed more progress to be had. I should also mention that Gemini 3 is a great daily driver, and a lot of people are getting a ton of value out of it. It's helped put Google in a leadership position in a way that it hasn't had in the entire history of the post-ChatGPT AI world. Usage is up, total number of users is up, monthly active users is up, amount of time per session is up. In fact, the amount of time per session is over ChatGPT, the last stats I saw. But it's also been early. And so in a lot of ways, this ranking reflects the bookending of the GPT-5 to Gemini 3 period between August and November of this year, where a lot shifted in terms of our expectations for where we were and what the market could expect from AI. Next up, number 4 on our list is DeepSeek and the space it made for the other Chinese open weight models, Kimi and Qwen. Now, I talked pretty extensively about DeepSeek in the 10 Biggest Stories episode, so I won't rehash all of that. But the TLDR is that the release of DeepSeek R1 really kicked the year off with a bang. We had DeepSeek ahead of ChatGPT on the App Store, which, as I discussed in that other episode, had a lot to do with the fact that it was the first time that people got their hands on a reasoning model. But we also got the reports that R1 cost just hundreds of thousands or at most low millions of dollars to train, as compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars that the major Western models cost. Now, in a single day, that wiped $593 billion off of NVIDIA's market cap. On the concern, of course, that all of this infrastructure was for nothing if China was just going to figure out ways to train these models for pennies. But importantly, this number 4 slot is not just for DeepSeek, even though DeepSeek got it started. One of the major themes of 2025 was the rise of Chinese open weight models. Qwen had a lot of success, but recently it was Kimi K2 thinking that really grabbed people's attention. This thing came out in November before GPT-5.1 and 5.2 and before Gemini 3, and just absolutely smashed many of the big benchmarks. It was ahead of GPT-5 and Claude Sonnet 4.5 on benchmarks like Humanity's Last Exam. Indeed, it was not just us over here in the AI media world that were noticing Kimi. The Department of Commerce's Center for AI Standards and Innovation released a report showing that Kimi was giving evidence of the, quote, growing depth of China's AI industry. That followed another report from that same group in late September that was focused on DeepSeek. Outside of benchmarks and government reports, the proof is in the pudding. OpenRouter showed that starting from basically nothing at the beginning of the year, Chinese open source models dominated throughout the back half of 2025. And this image from Menlo Ventures makes the relative decline of Meta and Mistral all the more clear. At the end of 2024, effectively no one in the US was actively using Chinese models. Now heading into 2025, they are very much part of the landscape. While major enterprises might not be using Chinese models yet, the startups certainly are, and that is shaping the way the AI industry is developing in a huge way. For that reason, DeepSeek, Kimi, and Qwen together are our 4th most impactful model releases of the year. At number 3, and man, I kind of wanted to put this one at number 1, but I felt like that would have been too personal. I have Nano Banana. Now, I'm actually recording this just as OpenAI has released its new 1.5 image model as well, so we'll have to see how that performs. But Google's Nano Banana has really set a new standard for what you can do with an image model this year. The first iteration of Nano Banana came out over the summer, and as you might know, what was originally a codename just became the way that the model was known. And what was interesting about the release of Nano Banana is that what made it really powerful wasn't the fact that its raw generations were so massively better than anything else we had. It's that it had incredible fidelity to go in and edit in an extremely acute way. So basically, rather than just being in an endless loop of generate and then generate another and another, you could instead hone in on exactly what you wanted to change about a particular image, and it would actually change just that part. Now, along with that came really strong character and visual consistency, and it turns out that those upgrades, more than just better raw generation, opened up a huge array of new use cases. Indeed, the set of use cases that it opened up was so significant that it got me thinking that we need some sort of benchmark, call it an unlock score, that's all about how many new use cases a particular model unlocks or opens up. Now, a few months later, alongside Gemini 3, we also got Nano Banana Pro. And just like the original Nano Banana had done, Nano Banana Pro opened up some crazy new possibilities that totally transform what you can do with AI image generations. A couple things that made Nano Banana Pro so different. The first was that by embedding it with a reasoning model, it had a way better ability to help you figure out what you actually wanted to do with the model. That also led to a new capacity for infographics and information visualizations, unlike anything that we had ever seen before. It wasn't very long ago that image generation models couldn't handle text at all. And now we can use Nano Banana Pro for things like exercise guides, for recipes, or of course, loading up the transcript of a podcast and letting it create infographics. It's also unlocking, in the context of Google's Notebook LM suite, higher quality AI slide generation than anything we've had before as well. Earlier this month, Ethan Malik wrote, "I did not expect that the PowerPoint killer would be something called Nano Banana Pro, but that is where it's heading. It makes the major efforts by all the other AI companies, including Microsoft, to crack PowerPoint by using Python seem like a dead end. Image gen is all you need? ? He continues, Notebook LM can just take source material, a topic, and an idea and make a very pretty impactful deck. Hallucinations are very rare, although there are still some spelling and graphics issues. Editing capability is apparently coming, but the direction is clear. In fact, Nano Banana information visualizations and infographics have gotten so ubiquitous so fast that there's almost a look now that people are already getting sick of because it's everywhere. And that's just a few weeks into having access to this capability. I honestly think that for the vast majority of the world, especially the business world who is going to take great advantage of this, we have barely scratched the surface of just how many new capabilities this quality and type of image generation model unlocks. And for that reason, Nano Banana is the number 3 most impactful model release of the year. Although, like I said, in my heart, it's number 1. Number 2, once again, goes to a pair of models. OpenAI's first reasoning models, O1 and O3. Now, yes, for you sticklers out there, OpenAI released a preview version of O1 back in September of 2024. It was the follow-up after they hadn't been able to get their next big core model, and the way they kind of started to shift their focus. It wasn't until December 17th, however, that we got a full-fledged version of O1, which is why I felt comfortable including it in the 2025 list. A couple months later, in April, we got O3, and for a very long time this year, O3 was my favorite and most used model. O3 totally transformed the ability of ChatGPT to help you think through strategy, to make plans, to think logically through problems. It was an absolute revelation. And once you used O3, it was absolutely impossible to go back to the non-reasoning models. Indeed, GPT 4.5 was effectively a non-actor throughout the year, ultimately being deprecated with a whisper and absolutely no protest from anyone. Now, as I got into in the 10 Top Stories episode, it's absolutely clear that reasoning models have taken over. Yes, there are still some use cases that don't require the reasoning models, but they are discrete and they are certainly not the core of particularly professional and business usage. Starting from a base point of effectively 0 on January 1st, by November, reasoning models represented over half of all usage according to OpenRouter. One interesting sub-story, I think the world would have looked very different this year and perception would have been very different if OpenAI had actually just called O3 GPT-5 instead. They didn't, and that obviously caused a lot of the consternation we got into earlier in the episode, but there is absolutely no denying that the reasoning paradigm has completely shifted how we interact with AI, how we think about scaling AI. And for that reason, O1 and O3 get the nod as the number 2 most impactful model releases of 2025. Now, astute observers then will notice that there is one company that has not been represented at all so far, which might surprise you, given that I called vibe coding the most important story and the most important theme of 2025 overall. What will not surprise you then is that I am considering the bundle of Anthropic models, 3.7, 4, and 4.5 in their various variations, basically a sequential set of models that replaced one another as the preferred model for developers, as the most impactful models of 2025. Anthropic's dominance of developer preference is something that I think is going to be studied for quite some time. While other companies focused on lots of different things all at once, chasing multimodality and general performance and lots of different types of target audiences, Anthropic locked in very early around the idea that coding was going to be extremely important, not only as a use case in and of itself, but as a way for AI models to be performant with non-coding related challenges. And while I've singled out the models here that came out in 2025, Anthropic's coding dominance really started with the release of 3.5. Before the reasoning paradigm had really taken hold, it was Claude 3.5 Sonnet that started to show people that AI coding might actually turn into a thing in short order. Now, interestingly, each of these models has been so good in their own way that they found some resistance among adherents to change. You had folks who stuck with 3.5 for a while, even after 3.7 was released, same with 4. And it wasn't really until Opus 4.5 that the paradigm shift was so great that everyone just got on board almost immediately. Importantly though, alongside the releases of these models, Anthropic was also investing in the broader coding and agentic ecosystem. 3.7 Sonnet, for example, was released alongside Claude Code, which, as we heard from Mike Krieger earlier this month, had already transformed how Anthropic was coding internally before it was released to the public. In May, Timothy Lee wrote, "An underrated AI story over the last year has been Anthropic's success in the market for coding tools. Said engineer Sholto Douglas, we believe coding is extremely important. We care a lot about coding. We care a lot about measuring progress on coding. We think it's the most important leading indicator of model capabilities. That focus," writes Timothy, "has paid off. And indeed, in many ways, a lot of the back half of this year has been a story of the other labs racing to catch up with Claude's performance when it comes to coding-related tasks." What's interesting, too, is that the incredibly strong and consistent developer preference for Claude models for coding is bigger than just benchmarks. Each subsequent Anthropic model rates at or near the top of all the benchmarks related to coding, but the preference goes way beyond that. And while all of these models were significant in their own way, and there is a risk of recency bias, I don't know that I've ever seen a model provoke such a strong and sustained strong reaction as Opus 4.5 has. In the immediate wake of the model, we had people like Dan Schipper from Every saying that Opus 4.5 blew them away and that we'd reached a new level of autonomous coding. He wrote, "You've been able to one-shot an impressive app demo for a while now with any frontier model. Opus 4.5 is the first model that just keeps coding and coding without running into endless loops of errors." Dan leveled that up a couple days later, saying the world changed last week. Opus 4.5 is the best coding model I've ever used. It can keep coding and coding autonomously without tripping over itself, and it marks a completely new horizon for the craft of programming. The dream is here. You can now write English and make software. Amir from Doist writes, "Apart from topping benchmarks, Opus 4.5 feels like it's in a league of its own. It's the first time I felt that an LLM can write better code than most devs in real-world work." Matt Schumer, who had honestly the strongest positive reaction to 5.2 Pro of any public commentator, on December 14th wrote, "I was wrong. I've been spending more time using Opus 4.5 in Claude Code, and it's better than anything in Codex CLI. GPT 5.2 Pro is still a better engineer overall, but for agentic coding, Opus 4.5 is the best. Honestly, it's even prompting big reflection on the future of software engineering as a job." Menlo Ventures Didi Das writes, "A few software engineers at some of the best tech companies told me this week, my entire job these days is prompting Cursor or Claude Code with Opus 4.5 to do what I need and sanity checking it. We've crossed some intangible threshold of AI generalizing to most software." Maur Shlomo of Base 44 noticed an inflection point as well. He tweeted, "Vibe coding is going through a transition. I've been seeing a lot of posts lately about vibe coding ranging from it's shit, it's bad and only good for prototyping, all the way to RIP every SaaS company ever. Here's one thing I can say. Since we introduced Opus 4.5 and Gemini 3 to Base 44, the adoption we're seeing among organizations building their own CRMs and project management tools is astonishing. Yes, the results aren't as feature-rich as HubSpot or ClickUp, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're building a leaner, more customized version tailored to meet their specific needs. The ability to build your own tools is improving fast, and the software industry is about to look very different." McKay Wrigley writes, "The more I code with Opus 4.5, the more I think we're 6 to 12 months away from solving software. The model is pretty much there. I'll build like 3 versions of an app in a few hours just to explore options that each would have taken me 1 to 2 weeks less than a year ago. It's getting weird." I think it is pretty indisputable that coding is the breakout use case of AI this year, both on its own terms and in terms of what else it's going to enable in terms of model performance down the road. I also think it's indisputable that there is no company and no set of models more associated with the rise of AI and agentic coding than the Anthropic suite. They started the year strong, they're ending the year strong, and they built the devotion of a legion of developers in the process. For all those reasons, I believe that the suite of Anthropic models, each of which pushed AI coding a little bit further each time, are the most impactful model releases of the year. And for the sake of being able to disagree in a fun way, if you had to pin me down to pick just one, I guess I'd say the combination of 3.7 and Claude Code, because it was with us for most of the year. But I think based on the early response, once we have a little bit more time and space, Opus 4.5 will be seen as the biggest jump. And so even though it was only released at the end of November, it could be that Opus 4.5 specifically ends up being the most impactful model overall of 2025. So that's my list. I can't wait to hear what you guys think. Tweet at me, LinkedIn at me, YouTube at me, and let's dig into it. For now, that's going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening or watching as always, and until next time, peace. Today we are looking at 51 charts that tell the story of artificial intelligence heading into next year. Now, we are in the midst of end-of-year episodes, which is a combination, of course, of both looking back and looking forward, and this episode is all about the charts that sit right at that intersection. They are charts that tell us where AI is today and give us some idea of what we should be planning on heading into 2026. Given that there are 51 of these things, I am going to rip through them. So buckle up and let's talk about the 51 charts that explain AI in 2026. Quick note on the production of this. The charts were all sourced entirely by me. Part of my process for preparing this show is spending a ton of time on X/Twitter and using those bookmarks heavily. And I have a folder where I actually keep these types of charts. So step one was just going back and looking at the charts that I thought were most reflective of the current moment and had something to say about the year we're heading into. The second part of the process was outlining a somewhat rough organization of which charts I wanted to include. From there, I turned it over to Claude, ChatGPT, and Gemini to see how they would organize it. I liked Opus 4.5 best, so we went with that with a few tweaks. And then I handed that and the charts off to GenSpark and Manus to put it all together. And while GenSpark looked much better, it made some really weird leaps in terms of how it was describing things and had some errors. So ultimately we went with Manus, which was then exported to Google Drive for a final edit by me. Apologies for those of you who don't care about that. I just think a lot of you are also interested in the operator and production side of AI, so I like telling you how these things get put together. All right. As you can see, we've divided this into 7 categories: capabilities, infrastructure, markets, economics, vibe coding, jobs, and politics. We kick off with capabilities. First chart comes from OpenRouter and is the reasoning versus non-reasoning token trends over time. You've probably seen this one a couple times now. Basically, at the beginning of 2025, reasoning models were not yet really a thing. OpenAI had announced O1 Preview back in September, and it had finally become available at the very end of December, but we were just starting to get our hands on these things. That would change dramatically over the course of the last year, and by November of 2025, reasoning tokens represented meaningfully over 50%. This has brought with it new capabilities, new use cases, and new ways of thinking about how we scale. Our next chart is the one that for much of this year held up the entire world, it felt like. This is the chart from Meter that measures the time horizon of software engineering tasks that different LLMs can complete at 50 and 80% success rates. So the task duration here is not how long the model works for independently, it's how long in human equivalent time a task can complete. Coming into this year, Meter had shown a doubling of capability roughly every 7 months, but it had started to inch up to closer to 4 months, and this year reified that 4-month doubling time. In these charts, you can see the 7-month doubling line in green and the 5-month doubling line in red, and you can see how at 50%, it hews really closely to the 4-month line, and at 80%, it's mostly on the 4-month line, with a few recent ones in between the 4 and the 7-month line. Now, whether it's 7 months or 4 months, the point is, capabilities have not plateaued, they continue to increase dramatically and quickly. We are also seeing major efficiency gains. This chart shows the performance efficiency of Gemini 3 Flash, which is better performing than Gemini 2.5 Pro, which was state-of-the-art just a few months ago, for around a third of the cost. Especially as we move into a world where production workloads are getting bigger and bigger, and we are consuming more tokens, the fact that it's not just capabilities, but also efficiency and costs that are improving is a big deal. Another measure of the efficiency gains came with 5.2's performance on the Arc AGI 1 exam. The Arc AGI benchmark folks noted that between a tweaked O3 model last year and GPT 5.2 this year, there was a 390% efficiency gain in a single year. Now, what this all adds up to in terms of when we get AGI is kind of anyone's guess. As you can see from this chart, people are all over the place in terms of when they think we're actually going to get AGI. By the way, there's no common definition of AGI, and there are even plenty of folks out there who think that the term is getting more and more meaningless. One interesting note is that I think that if anything, people's timelines actually got moved back slightly heading into 2026 from where they were heading into 2025, despite all these capability gains. Andrej Karpathy, in particular, in a big interview he did, might have single-handedly set back the timeline a couple of years. Now, as we look at these new releases, they are not just incremental. In many cases, they are solving key challenges. The charts we have here are for a long context test that basically tests how an LLM's performance degrades the more context you give it. With GPT-5.1, which is like a month old at this point, you can see that performance on this test went from around 85 or 90% at 8K tokens to a little under 50% at 256K tokens, whereas with GPT-5.2 Thinking, it was at 100% to start and stayed very close all the way to the end. This makes that context window actually usable in a way that it just wasn't before, which is extremely powerful and opens up new use cases. Still, AI capabilities, as much as they are not evolving evenly. There are a bunch of different versions of this chart that have different size of spikes depending on how good you think AI is, but the idea here is that AI progress is not uniform. It is instead jagged, where a model can be superhuman at certain tasks and unbelievably incompetent at basic things that a kid could do. This jaggedness is a key facet of AI and is part of the challenge in implementing it well. Indeed, when it comes to what slows down AI, there are a set of 3 different bottlenecks. This chart comes from a recent essay by Professor Ethan Mollick, who organized it into capability bottlenecks, process bottlenecks, and verification bottlenecks. Capability bottlenecks are the ones we think about most, the weaknesses in AI and that jagged performance. Process bottlenecks are the ones that we really started to reconcile with this year, the things that make it hard to overlay AI onto existing systems, particularly in the enterprise, and have it do what it's able to do. A third layer, which we talk about not very much, is a new category that is native and endemic to AI, which is verification bottlenecks. Basically where humans become crucial to reviewing edge cases and ensuring final accuracy, which is often a whole new set of processes that humans need to be organized around. I feel like in some ways, the first profession to really reconcile with these verification bottlenecks is software engineering, which has seen such a shift over the course of this year in how AI and agentic coding supports what they do, but has created all these new challenges and shifted a lot of the work to that verification step. Regardless of the challenges, one thing that this year showed is a massive explosion of diversity in the model set. The major labs are putting out more different types of models that have different strengths and weaknesses and are optimized for different types of use cases. But Chinese labs have also exploded and become a major player when it comes to the choices that builders have access to. Next up, we move to infrastructure. Obviously, the big theme of this year, which will continue to dominate heading into next year, is the hyperscalers making just historically large capital investments into AI infrastructure in the form of data centers. This represents one of the largest coordinated technology investments in history, and something that the market has really had to reconcile and wrap its head around. The level of investment is why people are asking questions about whether the output of AI and the revenue that comes from that can possibly justify it. And yet, all of the big labs feel exactly the same, which is, as Mark Zuckerberg has articulated many times this year, it is a much greater risk to underinvest than to overinvest. Another expression that we got that tells the story of the moment in such a simple chart is the capital going into office construction versus data center construction. This was actually from a couple months ago, and I'm sure that it is actually fully flipped at this point. But starting in 2023, you see a shift where less capital is going into offices and more capital is going into data centers. And sometime in the middle to the late part of 2025, those lines actually overlapped, where we're now seeing more money spent on data center construction than on office construction. Now, one of the things that some people ask is how much all of this new infrastructure really matters. This chart shows that slower growth in compute could lead to substantial delays of possibly years in terms of certain capability milestones. Now, it's a whole separate question as to whether there are actually benefits to those delays. For example, if you ask Bernie Sanders, there absolutely are. But the point that this chart is trying to make is that there will be consequences to the speed of AI development if these labs don't have access to the compute that they're looking for. And this chart shows that as much as the labs have to service their existing customers, they are still heavily investing in the future. Now, this is 2024, and I'd be interested to see an update for 2025. But in 24, you can see OpenAI's R&D compute was $5 billion, as opposed to its inference compute, which was at about $2 billion. I'm not sure that they were able to maintain this ratio this year. Given the release of their images model, which was their most viral moment of the year, plus the release of Sora, plus just continued growth in their base usage, you have to think that servicing their existing customers started to compete with R&D a little bit more this year in ways that could be challenging heading into the future. Certainly, there is scuttlebutt going around that some folks inside OpenAI aren't particularly happy about how that ratio looks right now. From there, we move into markets. The first chart to note is sort of the most obvious. The chatbot adoption is absolutely massive and faster than anything else we've ever seen before. I hardly need to spend a lot of time on this, but we now have 2 chatbots in ChatGPT and Gemini that are absolutely careening towards 1 billion active users. Something that it took the previous fastest growing technologies 5+ years at the very minimum to achieve. Still, if there was one chart that defined AI for markets this year, it's all of the various permutations of this circularity chart. This shows how much revenue and deal making flows between the major players like Microsoft, OpenAI, and Oracle. Now, to some, this chart is Exhibit A in why AI is a house of cards. But of course, what this chart is missing is a visualization of the very significant and real revenue that is also coming in to help fuel this. Of course, the revenue isn't even close to the total scale of deal making right now, but it is growing faster than anything we've ever seen, and we really have barely started to scratch the surface on monetization. Still, this chart is as good a Rorschach test as we have for how you feel about the markets heading into the next year. Paired with this, we have a recent chart of OpenAI's estimated balance sheet that shows just how much external capital they're going to need to get to the point where they're actually profitable. Now, so far, it doesn't seem like they're going to have any problem accessing that capital. The most recent rumors are that they are raising tens of billions of dollars, if not up to $100 billion at an $830 billion valuation, suggesting that capital markets are very comfortable with what they're seeing from OpenAI and very willing to fund this party to keep going. Now, for those who are AI bears, one of the things that they are concerned about is the reduction in inference costs, where as models get good enough, AI products can actually run on much cheaper, simpler GPUs and computers. They worry that if that happens, all of this massive investment in complex architectures doesn't really make sense anymore. One investor I saw called this chart the most important and misunderstood chart in AI. Now, it should be noted that not everyone agrees with this, and there are lots of counterarguments. But if we're trying to understand where the market's head is at heading into next year, this is a key consideration. Now we move into some model competition. Anthropic, by any measure, had a very good year. Their market share in coding was massive, and that dragged their market share across the enterprise up as well. According to Menlo Ventures estimates, they now claim 40% of the enterprise market ahead of OpenAI. Google also saw a lot of growth in enterprise this year as well. And as fast as OpenAI's revenue has been growing, Anthropic has been growing even faster. They went from $1 billion annualized at the beginning of this year and will end the year at somewhere around 8 or 9 billion, it seems. OpenAI started at around 4 billion and will end the year at 13 or 14 billion, which is absolutely incredible, but still growing more slowly than Anthropic, at least for the moment. Still, if you are just taking a step back and don't have a particular horse in this race, the thing to note is just the incredible pace of revenue growth for both of these companies, which has to be bullish for their ability to actually make good on all these big deals that they're signing over the course of the next 5 years. Another key story of 2025 that sets up the battle for 2026 is, of course, the massive resurgence of Google. You can see this moment around the launch of GPT-5, which also happened to be the launch of the first version of Nano Banana, that Gemini really starts to take off. The release of Gemini 3 has also purportedly even increased this competition, and Gemini is absolutely surging heading into next year. Another way that you can see this expressed is in the betting markets, where the likelihood that Alphabet is the largest company by the end of next June has increased significantly. NVIDIA held a commanding percentage of that at the beginning of the year, and Alphabet is now creeping up on them. Now, the other way to see the sentiment shift between OpenAI and Alphabet is in the basket of correlated stocks. Bloomberg and Morgan Stanley put together a basket of stocks that are exposed to Alphabet and a basket of stocks that are exposed to OpenAI, and showed how around November they started diverging, with the Alphabet exposed stocks continuing to rise and the OpenAI exposed stocks taking a bit of a hit. Now, this doesn't mean anything fundamental. It just means a shift in what markets believe, but it's a pretty clear and dramatic signal of where things are. Still, if you are one who is just looking at the performance of these different models, I think one of the most powerful charts is this one, which shows that no one stays on top for long. OpenAI introduces the world's most powerful model, followed by Anthropic, who introduces the world's most powerful model, followed by Gemini, who introduces the world's most powerful model, followed by Grok, who introduces the world's most powerful model. On and on forever, infinity. Just from a performance capability standpoint, this is absolutely the chart that best shows what we are going to experience throughout 2026, I strongly believe. However, if we're talking about the competition between the labs, we do have to give China its due. This chart shows the massive increase in China as a share of open source tokens. At the beginning of the year, it was all Meta and Mistral, with almost nothing coming from China. By the end of the year, it was something like 80% Chinese models. They are a factor heading into next year and will be a bigger factor throughout 2026. Next up, we move over to economics, by which we mean the impact of AI. We've talked already a little bit about how the cost of using AI has fallen precipitously. What's interesting, of course, is that Jevons paradox has fully locked in, and the total amount that enterprises are spending on AI has gone nothing but up. In fact, price decreases are fueling usage growth as price decreases unlock new types of use cases that were uneconomical before. This has led to enterprise AI being the fastest scaling software category in history. According to Menlo's estimates, it now captures 6% of the $300 billion global SaaS market. Now, it should be noted that I don't think that the total addressable market for AI is the $300 billion global SaaS market. I think it is multiples larger than that. But still, even in historically slow-moving and lumbering enterprise adoption, things are moving very, very quickly. What's more, despite some rumors to the contrary, companies are actually seeing measurable ROI from AI even now. In a Wharton study of something like 800 executives, around 75% reported positive ROI from their AI investments. On our AI ROI benchmarking study, we found 82% saw current positive ROI. Of the remainder, by the way, only 5.5% were currently at negative ROI, and even those that were at negative ROI anticipated that becoming ROI positive by next year. In fact, 96% of overall respondents anticipated positive ROI within the next 12 months. And across the entire sample, 37%, almost 4 in 10, were already seeing high ROI from their use cases, reporting either significant or transformational impact. In another chart from our ROI study, we also found a correlation between how diverse an organization's use of AI was and how much benefit they got. We organized impact into 8 different benefit categories, and we found that when an organization had use cases with just one benefit type, their ROI was lower than organizations that had 4 different benefit types, who were lower than organizations who had all 8 different benefit types, in a pretty significant way. 3 was a measure of modest ROI, 4 was a measure of significant ROI. Organizations that had 1 benefit type were just over the edge of modest at 3.13, and organizations that had 8 benefit types were starting to creep on significant at 3.65. What about the idea of 2025 as the year of agents? Well, it turns out in practice, agents remain nascent. In that same Menlo study, they found about 10 times as much money being spent on assistants and copilots than were being spent on agents so far. In our ROI study, we found something similar. We divided use cases into 3 categories: assisted, automated, and agentic, and found 57% were in the assisted category, 30% were in the automation category, where the AI was managing a discrete workflow, and 14% were in that agentic category of autonomous work execution. One more in the economic section that is under-discussed, but I think is going to be extremely important next year. I anticipate that we're going to start seeing a much deeper integration of ads into the AI landscape. There are a variety of reasons for that, but they are not just about the business model needs of the labs, although that's a part of it. LLMs also appear to be a really good platform for ads. Check out these recent numbers from SimilarWeb. They looked at the average minutes spent on site after referral, the average page views on site after referral, and the average conversion rate of referrals if the source was ChatGPT versus Google. And in each case, ChatGPT absolutely thwumped Google. The average minutes spent on site were 3 times higher from referrals from ChatGPT. Average page views were 25% higher, and the conversion rate jumped from 5% to 7%. Basically, people who are finding sites through LLMs are more high intent, it appears, than your average Google browser, which again makes it a great place for sponsored links and ads. Next up, let's look at a category that was extremely important to 2025, vibe coding. Our first chart is just vibe coding grew really fast. We saw multiple companies surge into the 9 figures of revenue, some like Cursor creep up on $1 billion in ARR, and some like Claude Code blow past that. The combination of meaningful token cost and high consumption, plus implications for other use cases in LLMs, made coding-related performance become the industry's #1 priority. As we head into next year, however, especially engineering organizations are trying to figure out how to redesign themselves around AI coding. A chart that I've seen from Swyx, Sean Wang, and others is this semi-async valley of death chart. It looks at agent autonomy and measures the experience or observed productivity at various autonomy levels. On the one end of the spectrum, when coding agents are extremely responsive in very fast order, they can be extremely valuable for deep work focus on the hardest problems. On the other end of the spectrum, when they have a lot of autonomy, they can be great for simpler texts that are handled in the background. The challenge is in the middle range, where, as the chart puts it, it's not enough to delegate and it's not fun to wait. Now, different organizations are handling this differently, and I think Swyx even has some questions around whether this is exactly the right way to think about things. But for our purposes, this chart represents not just the semi-async valley of death, but just the broader set of questions that engineering organizations are going through heading into next year to redesign themselves around AI coding. The reason that this matters outside of software engineering is that I believe that they are the first department that will fully reorganize themselves around AI capabilities, and in so doing set a template that other departments and functions can start to follow. Another interesting chart showing the impact of vibe coding, after a long period of being flat, in 2024 and 2025, we started to see the number of apps and games released to the App Store going back up. The jump in 2025 was particularly acute, going up 25% in a year. Some are attributing this to the rise of vibe coding, and I think that that's right. Now, for our last 2 sections, we move into the society level issues and the charts that will shape some of the big debates that we're about to have. This chart has been absolutely everywhere. The idea of a K-shaped economy, where stocks and asset owners are doing great and everyone else is doing not so great, has become fairly standard belief at this point, and there are many who want to attribute it to the launch of ChatGPT. Now, there are a ton of other factors like the rate hiking cycle and the return to the mean after post-COVID overhiring. But when it comes to politics and society-level conversations, narratives can often matter more than nuance. And there are some parts of the economic challenge for people, whether attributable to AI or not, that are undeniable. For example, we have the highest youth unemployment rate we've had since about 2015 if you don't take into account the COVID spike. What's more, to the extent that we are seeing patterns that are maybe actually attributable to AI, it does look like early career folks are being hit the hardest. This is a chart of the headcount over time, organized by different career sectors, and you could see towards the end of 2022, there's a divergence between the mid and senior career folks, with early career really falling off. To the extent that AI is taking on all of the junior tasks, there is going to be a really interesting challenge for us around how people bridge from their early career to their mid-career. Now, some folks are starting to think about where the job disruption is likely to come. There were about 1 million studies this year that were less studies and more predictions of which types of jobs are going to be most subject to disruption. One really valuable chart came out of Stanford, who divided tasks and roles based on where workers desired automation and based on where AI was actually capable of automation. Roles and tasks where workers desired automation and where AI was capable is what they called the green light zone. Tasks where automation desire was high, but automation capability was low, they called the R&D opportunity zone. Tasks where capability was high, but desire was low, is what they called the red light zone. And unfortunately, some others looked there and found that a lot of, for example, Y Combinator startups were working in that red light zone, which I think more than anything reflects just the fact that we need to be having these conversations more around where we actually want automation. Now, as narratives take hold of AI labor disruption, some studies are also pointing out that counterfactually, that's not necessarily the only thing that's showing up. A recent study, for example, showed that in terms of both wage growth and overall job growth, occupations with high AI exposure, at least right now, are growing much more significantly than those with low exposure. All of which sets us up for the politics conversation. Merriam-Webster's word of the year was slop. And I had tweeted that I think that it tells you all you need to know about the difference of our perspective inside the AI industry than outside, that it was slop and not something like vibe coding that was the word of the year. And yet, as much as it seems like AI is going to become an issue, at least for right now, most folks don't rate it super highly as something they care about. Only 7% of people polled had AI in their top 5 most important issues. That said, they definitely don't want companies to have a free hand. Recent polling around the White House executive order to ban state-level regulation had pretty strong opposition, 55% opposed to just 18% supporting it, with 27% not sure. And while broadly the issue may not be clear, data center politics are starting to emerge as a local issue. It's still very nascent, but in a couple of elections we saw this year, it was a meaningful part of the discourse. I would expect to see a lot more of that heading into the midterms next year. So there you have it, my friends, 51 charts that explain AI heading into 2026. Hopefully this was an interesting lens to look at things through. I will have a link to this presentation if you want to download it on AIDailyBrief.ai. For now, that is going to do it for today's episode. Appreciate you watching or listening, and until next time, peace. Today we are casually talking through 50 AI predictions for 2026. All right, friends, the time has come to shift from looking backward to looking forward. And I'm thrilled to spend the next 2 days looking at AI predictions for 2026. Now, originally, I had intended this to be a single episode, but when I got to an hour and 47 minutes of raw recording, it was quite clear that 2 episodes was on the docket. For the visuals, I dumped my outline into both GenSpark and to Manus to help produce this. And rather than picking one or the other, I decided I'm just going to go back and forth between them. A, so you can get a feel for how these various tools perform, but B, to keep it a little bit more visually interesting, as this is a particularly talky type of episode. I've organized the predictions into about 7 categories: models and capabilities, vibe coding, enterprises plus vibe coding, enterprise trends, not including vibe coding, competition, market, and politics. Now, number 3, enterprises and vibe coding, probably could have just been in one or the other, but they were distinct enough that I decided to keep them independent. Let's kick off with models and capabilities. Broadly speaking, I think that we are going to stay roughly on the meter line. Now, this is obviously a GenSpark made-up chart, and the meter line I'm talking about is this one. This is the chart that measures the length of a task in human hours that different models can complete at 50 and 80% success rates. This line has been fairly consistent for some time now. For a while, we saw capabilities doubling every 7 months, and more recently it's jumped up to closer to 4.5 months. You can see here the difference between the 7-month line and the 4-month line on both the 50 and the 80% reliability threshold. Now, it is at least theoretically possible that we see recursively self-improving AI, but I think it's far more likely that the new NVIDIA architecture, which is coming online in the form of Blackwell chips and then eventually Hopper chips, keeps us on something like this trajectory, even as we max out capabilities and move them beyond human capacity in a lot of different areas. Next up, I think we are going to get a lot more models a lot more frequently. GPT-5, more than anything, showed that there is just a ton of risk in building up big expectations around a single model release. Now, yes, of course, Gemini 3 was kind of the opposite, but the hit to OpenAI and more broadly the entire AI field that GPT-5 wrought probably could have been avoided by a different approach to release schedules. Of course, to be fair to OpenAI, they had released models in between. We had O3, O4 Mini, but they obviously had built a lot of expectations around their big 5.0 model. Subsequent to that, we have gotten 5.1, then 5.1 Codex, then 5.2, then 5.2 Codex, all in very short order from one another. Anthropic, of course, was kind of already on this tip, not only releasing more sub-variations, but also splitting the releases of their Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus versions in a way that took some pressure off of any one release. Now, for all of us users, this is going to be a little bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we are pretty constantly going to have new toys to play with, but on the other, there is going to be a never-ending slate of new things to test and try and figure out if they actually improve upon the existing models for your particular use cases. What's more, I think especially when it comes to writing type tasks, or just generally being smart, research, etc., Model upgrades are going to be increasingly vibe-based. This is, of course, due to the fact that all of the premier models are really good right now. When I'm deciding between Gemini 3, Opus 4.5, and GPT 5.2 for some writing or research use case, it's largely going to be stylistic for me and use case by use case. Now, what this may lead to for most users is just picking one that generally they like the vibes of best and sticking with it, knowing that even if one of the other models gets ahead for a moment, there's probably a new release coming right around the corner that will get your preferred model back up to the state of the art. That said, because there's so much saturation and similarity around a lot of those base writing and thinking type of tasks, I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on multimodal competition. Already you're seeing that. Nano Banana Pro, which Manus used, of course, to create these images, you can kind of tell, felt every bit as significant to Google's second half of the year as did Gemini 3. And obviously OpenAI did not wait very long to respond, even moving up the release of their Images 1.5 model. It is very clear that OpenAI is not seeding this, even if Google does look like the juggernaut in this particular area. It's worth noting that Grok also isn't seeding this, continuing to push both images and video. The only major lab that has very clearly taken themselves out of this particular race, which actually never entered it, is Anthropic. Now, in addition to multimodal, I also predict that there will be a lot more emphasis on productization and the interface around models. Again, if you think that the models are pretty commensurate with one another and all kind of at the state of the art, then the choices you're going to make as a user of those models is going to shift to other areas, such as, for example, the user experience and how navigable they are, how much it helps you do what you need to do with them. I think the fact that OpenAI put a distinct user experience, even if a very limited one, around the images release is testament to that fact. And of course, I'm talking about even in the context of the foundation model labs, given that there are already so many of what used to pejoratively be called wrapper companies that have become extremely successful by focusing on specific interfaces for specific industries and use cases. One particular interface that I think that we're likely to see is what I'm calling a notebook LM for agent building, by which I really mean a really simple studio type of interface for building agents. I fundamentally don't believe that the drag and drop automation type builders that you see with products like Zapier and Lindy, as powerful as they are and as useful for power users as they are going to be an interface that takes building agents to the mainstream. Now, Notebook LM might not exactly be the right analogy. I just mean we're going to have distinct experiences, I think, for building agents, some of which come from the major labs themselves. Google is a good bet to deliver this first, given that Google AI Studio is kind of already inching towards this in a number of ways. Still in the models and capabilities section, I believe that the focus on coding that we saw throughout 2025 not only won't decrease, it will radically ratchet up. It is both a massive use case, but also a capability set that unlocks lots of other use cases, and you better believe it is going to be very much on the minds of every single lab with every single model they release. My next prediction is that we're going to learn in 2026 just how valuable it is to have last mile end user data that can help refine your models. Swix has framed one of the competitive battles, which I'll talk about in the competition section, as the agent labs versus the model labs. The agent labs, of course, are things like Cognition and Cursor, whereas the model labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. At the very end of 2025, we started to see the agent labs moving into the model space, taking advantage of the fact that they have a set of data that the model labs don't necessarily, because of how much of that end usage they have. Will that actually allow them to jump out ahead and become the next generation model labs? I don't know that that'll be decided in 2026, but we're certainly going to have a lot more information about it. Another prediction around where I think the labs are going to focus, memory feels to me like just obviously the biggest opportunity in some ways. Already the very nascent type of memory that we have in these LLMs at the end of 2025, as opposed to, for example, the end of 2024, has made a major difference. Likewise, already that limited memory is maybe the biggest barrier preventing people from model switching. I'm about as voracious a model switcher as they come, with the top level of every subscription across all of the major models. And yet, despite the fact that I try most use cases across most models, there are certain things where the memory that one of the models has about a particular area of business or previous conversations I've had just means it's too much of a pain to transfer from one to the other. Now, this is not a particularly difficult prediction. It's something, for example, that Sam Altman is already talking lots about, but I do think it's going to be an increasingly important focus, especially if and as the other models start to catch up with ChatGPT and they're looking for better ways to lock users in. One thing you might have heard me talk about a little bit in my review of the A16Z big ideas is my thoughts on world models. I think that this is going to continue to be an area that people are really excited about. I think we're going to see some new entrants to the market. Jan LeCun, for example, left Meta and is purportedly raising $500 million at a big valuation to go pursue this opportunity. But I think that in 2026 specifically, we're going to continue to get really cool demos and maybe some really early sandboxes, but I don't think that we're going to have a generalist usability type of moment yet. Right now, world models feel a little bit to me like the VR of the AI world, where it's not hard to understand how powerful they could be in theory, but because they represent some totally new capability set for experiences and are not just a one-to-one replacement for things we used to do, there's just going to be a lot more time to shift that type of behavior. Now, world models are valuable for more reasons than just the end user. Obviously, many people think that they are a better path to AGI than the approaches we're currently taking. So in that way, they're not like VR as some new consumer category. But I still think that when it comes to their maturity, I'd be surprised if we were all using some major model by the end of 2026. I would, of course, be delighted to be wrong on this one. Lastly, in the models and capabilities section, I think that in 2026, we're going to see the lines between assistants and agents get more blurry, not more clear. What I mean by that is that I think that the way that agents will start to make their way into the real world on a wider array of use cases is still going to be through individual users delegating more to them. I think that users shifting and using agents to manage more complex tasks, like for example, taking this outline and turning it into a 56-slide presentation, is going to be the way that agentic AI starts to proliferate, particularly in the enterprise. Now, this is not to say that we also won't see lots of progress on fully autonomous agents, but I think in practice, it's more likely that 2026 is the year of agent managers than is the year of full autonomy. Next up, let's talk vibe coding. And by the way, I've decided now that I've gone through a full section, jumping back and forth between Manus and GenSpark, that I just like the GenSpark better in this case. Manus did a great job as well, but it's got a little bit too much of that obvious Nano Banana Pro sheen for our purposes here. So next section, vibe coding, obviously one of the biggest themes of 2025. So how do I think it's going to change next year? First of all, I think we're going to see a big bifurcation. Right now, we use the same words to describe two totally different things: vibe coding or AI and agentic coding within software engineering organizations, and vibe coding among non-developers. These are wildly different things, and I think that we'll stop treating them as the same thing. Now, moving into what that's going to mean, I think that on the engineering side, we came into 2025 with there still being a ton of resistance, especially among enterprise engineering departments, to AI and agentic coding. By the end of the year, we've shifted all the way to the conversations being about how to best handle and organize different types of autonomy, how to manage the new challenges that AI and agentic coding create, where and in what ways organizations think they need to ignore certain capabilities so their own capabilities don't atrophy. But all of it, I think, amounts to a big reorganization of engineering organizations to take advantage of AI-enabled coding. Now, this might seem obvious, and for those of you who are in startups or who live deep in the AI industry, this has probably just been happening continuously throughout the year. But I think you're going to see it start to jump into even traditional organizations that are really going to have to reevaluate how they're structured, how they deliver, how they deploy. Next up, and one of the predictions that I feel most strongly about, vibe coding is going to move beyond prototypes into production mode in non-tech areas of the enterprise. That could be things like custom legal contract analyzers, onboarding apps for HR. I think you're going to see a ton of vibe-coded experiences enter the marketing world. And of course, these things may never touch the engineering organization. You might still have engineering departments that make sure these things don't introduce new security risks or are production ready if they're public facing. But I think we're going to see production mode vibe coding enter all the non-tech areas of the enterprise this year. On the consumer side, I think we are going to see a lot of bespoke personal software. Some people have called this ephemeral software. I don't think that the terminology is exactly figured out yet. But the idea here is basically people building themselves tools because it's easier to chat with Lovable or Replit or whatever they're using and get a thing that is exactly tailored to them than it is to go find and tweak some existing app experience, or maybe that thing just doesn't exist. For example, right now I have a gift tracker that I was using to keep track of what we had got for our kids so we don't end up getting way too much, as always happens with me, which is an example of something that just doesn't exist right now. Or honestly, I didn't even really look to find to see if it did because I knew exactly what I wanted and it was easier to just build it. And I also built myself a simple fitness tracker. Now, I've tried like every different fitness tracker, and it's not that they didn't have the features that I was looking for. I just wanted something very specific that made sense to my particular brain, and it was easy enough to just build for myself. Anyways, I think we're going to start to see a lot more of this personal software start to happen this year. I've been vibe coding all year, and it's only just in the last month or so that I've felt myself start to naturally ask, Could I solve that with software? I think probably a growing number of people will start to have a similar experience, and that'll lead us in some really interesting places. One of the places I think that'll lead is we'll probably see a new class of AI app entrepreneur. Some number of these things that start off as people building for themselves, they'll probably figure out have kind of a market. And since they never needed to raise venture capital or anything like that, the economics of these things look totally different. Maybe, for example, you don't care about subscription costs, and you think people would be happier paying $10 one time than having to think about $2 a month for perpetuity. The other thing that makes this one interesting is, of course, ChatGPT becoming something of an app platform, although I don't think we have any idea yet exactly how that's going to play out, and whether there will actually even be a way for independent and smaller developers to actually find their way into that flow, or if it's just going to be dominated by the major partners. Another really hyper-specific prediction, I think it is going to be a very tough time for template-based website creation software. Once you have used English to manage your personal website, and when you want something changed, you can just explain it, you are never going back to templates. Now, of course, Wix and Squarespace are both aware of this. Wix bought Base44 and is heavily investing in this area, so it's not a knock on the companies themselves, but I think this mode of building personal websites is on its very, very last legs. One more super specific one. I think Shopify potentially has a uniquely important role in the AI ecosystem. Shopify is already how so many people, small creators, small builders, people who don't consider themselves technical at all, interface with e-commerce, and increasingly just interface with the entire spectrum of their online business. It's not just their store, it's also their website. Shopify has been extremely attuned to the AI opportunity, and I think because they serve such a normie audience who is definitionally not necessarily tech savvy, they have a really important role in transmitting and helping share the value that AI can bring, not just to tech people, but to regular people who are just trying to run their businesses more effectively. Speaking of businesses, let's move over to the enterprise world, starting with the section on enterprises and vibe coding. Overall, I think we're going to see a knowledge work vibification, which basically means we're going to see what happened with software engineering this year go into all other areas of knowledge work next year. Simply put, we're going to start to make a shift from doing to managing. This entire presentation is a great example of that. Now, I think that this is a 5 to 10 year megatrend, and so I don't want to overstate how dramatically the shift will happen, but I think it will feel distinct even inside big, lumbering, boring old organizations. I also think we are going to see new vibe coding specific roles. Basically, I think companies are going to start hiring people who have an overlap of some particular functional experience and also are good vibe coders. Think of them as internal forward deployed vibers. Now, Lenny Rachitsky recently called this out, saying that he had seen some of this happening. So maybe I'm cheating by making a prediction, but I definitely think that this is going to be a thing that more and more enterprises hire for in 2026. And the forward deployed vibers will, of course, help all the different departments and functions figure out how to use coding in ways that they couldn't before. Now, I've talked about personal software, but will companies build their own version of personal software? Basically, replacement software for their big enterprise software deals. Klarna very famously a couple years ago scrapped Workday and Salesforce and shifted to their own. And I've always been quite skeptical that that's something that companies are going to do en masse. So here's the nuance. I actually do think that in 2026, we are going to see companies build replacement software. But I don't think it's going to be massive companies ripping out Salesforce. I think this is going to impact small and medium-sized companies. The companies who, if you checked out the AI ROI benchmarking study, are operating a little bit more nimbly and already seeing more value from AI because they can take full advantage of it more quickly. I think you're going to see those types of companies who those big lumbering enterprise sales contracts were never necessarily a great fit for, increasingly not only not work with the Salesforces of the world, but also have a pretty high bar for even the long tail software providers, like in the case of CRM, a HubSpot or something like that. I think more and more, you are going to see people who don't have use for 70 or 80% of the features just build the 20% that they want, especially if it's internal facing and it can be a little clunky and broken. Now, this won't be ubiquitous. And of course, these SaaS providers are doing a lot to integrate AI features to make their products better. But I do think we are going to increasingly see companies build replacement software, particularly in areas like CRM. Now, moving to enterprises more broadly, to the shock of no one, I think that there is going to be a huge ROI and benchmarking focus. Call 2026 the year of the dashboard. Now, it's not that I think that companies will stop doing AI if they can't get precise measures of ROI, but I do think that they're going to start trying to measure things in a much more distinct and discrete way. In fact, I think it's kind of going to be the Wild West of measurement this year until we actually get some benchmarks under our belt. People are going to explore all sorts of different types of impact metrics and different ways of determining value. But I would expect it to be way more quantitative than qualitative heading into 2027 than it is heading into 2026. I also think that there is going to be a ton of focus on data and context engineering. I think investing in your AI and agent infrastructure is going to be sexy in the enterprise in 2026. Companies are going to realize that to really get full value, especially out of agents, they're just going to have to take the time and make the investment to have their data available to work for those agents. Now, they've known this for a while, but I think it'll really come to the fore and be something that people talk about and focus on, even to the exclusion of some random test agents in the year to come. Now, the next one is kind of an echo of what we talked about before with NotebookLM for agents, but I think that for enterprises to shift more of their behavior into the agent realm, in other words, out of the realm of assisted AI and automated workflows, it's going to take some serious interface improvements. Again, enterprises are not going to use Zapier-style builders, but I think that as we do get those new interfaces, a lot of opportunity will unlock. In fact, I kind of think that we're going to start to see a bit of a squeeze on that workflow automation this year. One of the things that's happening right now is that a lot of enterprises, and this makes sense, are trying to use AI to map how their humans currently do things to allow agents or realistically automated workflows copy that human process. In many cases, there could be a ton of value there. However, I think that it is highly likely that the real destiny will be total process reinvention based on new agentic capability, not just an agent copying what a human did. Agents are not humans. They work in different ways. To get the full value out of them, in most cases, we'll probably need to figure out or allow them to figure out the best way of accomplishing a goal without imposing an existing process on them. So I think you're going to start to see a squeeze on automation from both just the assisted AI on the one hand, which is going to continue to be a huge part of personal productivity gains that then can translate up into the organization, and actual new agentic processes from the other side that start to redefine how a workflow can work. Finally, in the enterprise, I think we are going to start to see the full impact of AI compounding. We're now at a point where the organizations that are leading are going to start to get farther and farther ahead, not just on their AI usage, but I think that their AI usage will actually start to open up not just efficiency gains in what they do now, but new opportunities, such as new product and revenue lines. As they do that, the distance between them and the AI laggards is going to do nothing but grow. For now, that is going to do it for today's episode. Appreciate you listening or watching. As always, until next time, peace. Today on the AI Daily Brief, part 2 of my AI predictions for 2026. All right, so yesterday we did the first part of my AI predictions, and because it got so long, we had to split it into 2. Today we are jumping in the competition section, where the AI race is headed into 2026. For our next set of predictions, let's talk about competition. My first prediction is that I think it's going to be very hard to shake Anthropic off its coding lead. They are incredibly focused on it. They have held that perceived lead for more than a year and a half, which is approximately 100 years in AI time. And you can absolutely tell that an increasingly large number of developers are so comfortable with the Claude models that even when OpenAI or Google or in the future Grok release something that is comparable or ahead on the benchmarks, it'll be very unlikely that they switch. Now, that won't be universally true. There's still lots and lots of room. And so I think it makes sense for everyone else to compete for coding still. I just think it's going to be hard to shake Anthropic off their lead. One specific prediction is that I think that this will lead ultimately to Microsoft doing a big deal with them, expanding that relationship even from the very nascent ways we started to see them get together this year. I think Microsoft will want to bring even more aggressively Anthropic's coding tools into their enterprise suite, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen in 2026. Now, for OpenAI, I think their big challenge is going to be fragmented attention. How much do they focus on consumer usage versus enterprise usage versus research that gets them to AGI? We've recently gotten a bunch of reports from inside OpenAI that not everyone there is super happy with the allocation of resources and are worried that all of these consumer things like Sora 2 are side quests that are actually distracting them from fundamental AGI research. Certainly, OpenAI itself has talked about the difficulty of having to make hard decisions about where to allocate compute. I do not believe in 2026 that OpenAI is going to cede any of these things. However, I do think that there will likely be some recognition that where they are dominant is on consumer. To many people, ChatGPT still is the same as AI. These are synonymous terms. And even as Gemini has surged, ChatGPT still has a commanding lead. My guess is that to the extent that OpenAI has to defend one flank, that'll be it. Now, one additional specific prediction is that I just believe that it's inevitable that ads will come to ChatGPT. If for no other reason, then if you look at charts of intent and how users that are sourced from an LLM interact as opposed to people coming from Google search, it's just a really good medium for advertising. I think OpenAI is going to continue to face questions in the market as to whether they can actually reach their heady revenue targets. And given that they have so much tied up in whether the market believes they can when it comes to funding all of this infrastructure, I think they're going to have to do some version of advertising. How well they do that and whether it causes a user rebellion will be key things to watch for in the coming year. Now let's talk about Grok. I have occasionally been accused by some of you of not giving Grok its due. Some of you have even secretly suggested that I am an Elon Musk hater, which is not true. The reason that Grok has come up less is that across all of the different use cases, where I try all the different models on basically everything I'm doing, I have yet to find a single use case where I regularly prefer Grok's output compared to Gemini, ChatGPT, or Claude. Every other one of those models has something I prefer better than the others. However, I still pay for Grok's most premium subscription. And I think if you judge Grok on the speed with which they have become a contender and are putting out models that are very near state of the art, if not there exactly, you cannot write them off as a contender in the AI race. What's more, Elon is in a unique position to raise capital and apply compute, and you could see a compute investment-based leapfrogging. It's also possible that external factors like political pressure and constraints on others that Elon just decides to ignore could also create a raison d'etre for Grok in a way that I don't see right now. I basically just don't know who the natural user is, other than someone who's already on Twitter, which, to be fair, is not an insignificant number of people. One good thing in Grok's favor is that if you look at OpenRouter, who Grok have partnered with to offer free tokens at various points this year, it is very clear that users have shown that they will use Grok if it's free or cheap, which, by the way, is not a knock on Grok. It's still early enough that people are willing, in many cases, to use a more expensive model than a less expensive one if it actually gets what they want done. So the fact that Grok has done so well on OpenRouter with those promotions is actually indicative of where it could go. But ultimately, if over the course of not just 26, but more like 26 and 27, and maybe even a little into 28, if it can't really differentiate itself and find some breakout that gives it a space relative to these others in the competition, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some mass absorption of the Elon empire all under, for example, the banner of Tesla. Next up, I think in 2026, we are going to see Meta re-enter the conversation, although I genuinely am at a loss for exactly what their direction will be. We have heard rumors that their next model will be closed source, but I have no idea what their spot in that is. I think what is clear is that where they will have strength is one, applying AI to social networks, particularly in terms of how it helps their ad products, so actually monetizing AI. And two, the success of the Meta Ray-Bans is undeniable. As of this moment, Meta has the only AI-related wearable that anyone actually likes, and people really like it. That could create momentum for an entire platform play that moves into other form factors as well. Next up, I think in 2026, the growth in Chinese open weight models that we saw throughout 2025 is going to continue in a massive way. Already, you have tons of US and Western startups turning to Chinese models for certain key workflows where what they need is efficiency, not just the pure state of the art. If China stays on the trajectory that they're on, and especially if they take advantage of these new H200s that the US is letting them purchase, I would expect to see them make up an even bigger share of production tokens consumed in 26 than they did in 25. Next prediction is that one of the most interesting competitive battles of the next year will be the agent labs versus the model labs, which I articulated a little bit before. Now, as I mentioned, I think the line between these two types of companies is getting a little bit blurrier, and where we're going to see this competition play out may be in the context of new models. This one is one I debated, of whether any of these big agent labs like Cursor, Cognition, Replit, or Lovable will get bought this year. The reason to think no is that these companies, to an insane degree, control their own destiny. They are all making a ton of money, they are high growth, they are beloved by their users, and so none of them have to sell. I also don't really see, among any of the leaders of these companies, people who are super keen to take their chips off the table rather than keep building. However, I feel like at least one of these agent labs gets an offer that is too big to ignore ultimately, with Microsoft in my mind being the most likely acquirer. Another area of M&A that I feel like is more high probability, I think both GenSpark and Manus get scooped up this year. Like I said, I think these labs are going to realize that they need better interfaces for agents. And they're going to look over and see that both Manus and Genspark have built really compelling starting points for that are more performant than the things they have internally, even if they're using those companies' models, and they're bringing with them a nice chunk of revenue. The reason I think these companies are going to be willing to be bought is one, the astronomical price that will be paid, but two, a concern that they inevitably are going to get competed out of the way by the model labs over the course of the next few years. Next up, we turn to markets. Especially in the second half of this year, public markets really started to interact with AI development in a major way. We moved from the unbridled enthusiasm from basically November 2022, when ChatGPT launched, all the way up to honestly around September of 2025, and then saw a mass repricing as public market investors just started to really rethink the fundamentals of just how much growth there could be. Indeed, I think that recalibration sets us up for the most important question for AI and markets in 2026, which is, will there continue to be private credit appetite for data center and AI infrastructure buildout? So far, as expensive as the AI buildout has been, it's all been financed, or mostly been financed, by the hyperscalers' balance sheets. Now, market analysts might have had to reset their brains when companies started spending their free cash flow on anything other than stock buybacks, but one of the best dampers to the AI bubble narrative so far, for a long time, had been the fact that this was all being financed by the companies themselves. That has, of course, shifted over the course of this year. A growing portion of the infrastructure buildout is being financed. And at the moment, private credit markets certainly have enough to keep that party going for some time. The question is whether they want to. We recently saw Blue Owl pull out of an Oracle financing deal, although Oracle has a different narrative for it, and that has made many wonder if we're going to see more of that next year. I predict that markets are going to be extremely on edge about absolutely any wobbles in data center financing. But I also tend to think that we're coming into 2026 in a much healthier spot with markets than we were last year. The repricing that has happened, the new appreciation for risk that is prominent, has a strong likelihood of tamping down enthusiasm before it gets over exuberant, in a way that I think is likely healthy. Which is not to say that things couldn't rip in one direction or another. I think, in fact, that a lot of AI's market destiny is going to be tied to broader macro factors. This has always been the story with AI, even when we haven't recognized it. This is perhaps best expressed of the virality of this chart showing the K-shaped economy. The chart has two lines. One is for the S&P 500, the other is for total job openings. From 2005 up to around 2023, the lines move in pretty lockstep. Since that inflection point, however, total job openings have gone down, while the S&P 500 has continued to go up. Now, most versions of this chart have a dotted line with some version of the text, "What happened on November 30th, 2022?" With, of course, the implication being that the launch of ChatGPT is the reason for those total job openings declining. However, as any macro commentator can point out, where the line actually shifts is not November when ChatGPT launches, it's a few months earlier when the rate hiking cycle begins. This huge spike you see in 21, coming after the big dip you see in 2020, is the COVID-era zero interest rate period, where everything just ripped up and to the right. There was significant overhiring during that period, and a big part of the story of the job openings declining is a recalibration of that. And another part of the story, which you can see where the lines actually dip, is rates going back up and inflation soaring off to the moon. Now, this is not to argue that AI has had no impact on job openings. But it is a good reminder that AI's market story has always been tied up with the macro in complex ways. For so much of the 2022 to early 2025 period, it was AI enthusiasm versus everything else. AI versus the hiking cycle, AI versus the tariff tantrum. You name it, AI just kept winning ultimately. It wasn't going to last forever, and it didn't last forever. And that has led to where we are today. Now, next year, there's going to be a lot going on. We're going to have a new Federal Reserve chair, and the White House presumably exerting a lot more influence on the Federal Reserve and rate policy. We have all the dynamics around the midterm elections. So almost outside of anything that actually happens in AI, a lot of what the market thinks about AI is going to be shaped by totally unrelated factors. Now, let's talk about the IPO market. I have such a hard time making up my mind for what I think is going to happen. My base case would be that we do not see any IPOs in 2026. I think we see both OpenAI and Anthropic in 2027. I think private markets are going to be strong enough, and the utter pain in the butt that is public markets is going to be a big deterrent. Startups have for some time wanted to stay private for as long as humanly possible, And I see no reason why it would be any different in this area. In fact, I see even more reasons why it wouldn't be different in this area. However, there are a lot of factors that could change that. One is OpenAI's massive capital requirements. That company is already basically shaking the couch cushions of the entire world. And it is not impossible that they get to a point where they feel like they just have to go pursue a public market strategy at the same time as everything they're doing privately. Indeed, if they get even a whiff that private markets are getting less enthusiastic or might not have enough capital for their needs, they might try to get out ahead of that shift before it becomes a broader public narrative. There's also the fact that if current reports are to be believed, OpenAI is going to IPO at a $1 trillion plus valuation. We don't really have precedent for that. And it's not clear how much higher they could be valued in private markets and still have a successful public offering. So that might also force their hand sooner. There is also the possibility that if they think that Anthropic are trying to lap them, in other words, to get out ahead and take advantage of public enthusiasm and retail investor enthusiasm for AI, that it might move up everyone's timescale. I kind of think that the inverse is less true, in the sense that I don't think that OpenAI moving faster would necessarily change Anthropic's plans. However, to the extent that they want to get in ahead of OpenAI, which has a lot of reasons to consider, that could push OpenAI to move faster. So like I said, from a prediction standpoint, my base case is 0 IPOs in 2026 and 2 in 2027, but there are so many things that could change that and make me wrong. Another kind of simple prediction, I think that sometime in 2026, Alphabet will become the biggest company in the world. I'm not sure for how long they have that title and whether it's sustained, but I think especially if the growth trend in Gemini continues, growth in Google's cloud business continues, and especially if they actually start to sell TPUs broadly outside of the Google organization, we'll see them jump to the top. This could also be caused by a stumble from NVIDIA, but I think that's less likely than a surge from Google. I think we're going to see the rise of artisanal anti-AI next year. In other words, we're going to see explicitly AI-free products, networks, and services. We're going to see the human-made label become a luxury symbol. We might even see certifications for 100% human-generated art, writing, you name it. Now, the big question will be whether these things are small or whether there's actually some major network that decides to go this way. Could the next social network be one that aggressively works to prevent AI bots? It wouldn't shock me. Last category of predictions is politics and policy. Right now, I think it's a little bit easy to overstate and overestimate how big a deal data centers are to people. In fact, outside of our little bubble in the AI world, when you look at polling of how much people actually have opinions on data centers, it's very low. However, in the areas where data centers are being built or have been considered, it is a very big issue. It is also an issue where it's very clear to me that politicians on both sides of the aisle, with a particular bent towards populists on both sides of the aisle, see it as a winning issue, and specifically being against it as a winning issue. It is very clear. Every political pundit will tell you right now that the number one issue heading into the midterms is going to be affordability. This is the word that we've chosen instead of economics to reflect the fact that what we're talking about is the specific difficult economics of living in America today. The anti-AI narrative writes itself. The robots are taking your jobs, your energy, drinking your water, and raising your power bill. Let's fight against them and your lives will be better. It will be extremely telling, I think, in 2026, how resonant this message actually is. Is it a winning political point in general, or only in those areas that are specifically dealing with data centers? I think the answer to that question will have a huge impact on the 2028 presidential elections. I think regardless of the answer to that question, however, pretty much all layoffs in 2026 are going to be attributed to AI. Now, in some cases, that will be true. A thing that humans used to do will be more easily or cheaply done by automation. That will come with restructuring and job loss. In other cases, AI layoffs will be attributed to AI, but it will be more indirect. It will be presented as a company reorganizing and repositioning for an AI future, where they need fewer people to do the same amount of work. We saw Amazon use this type of language a lot this year. And this is where it starts to get a little bit blurry. It's not crazy for an organization to be rethinking its broad organization structure in the context of AI. In fact, it would be crazy not to. But I think that you're going to see a lot of layoffs that would have happened anyway be lumped under that "we're getting ready for the AI future" kind of banner. And then, of course, there'll be other layoffs that have nothing to do with AI that are just blamed on it because it's a very convenient scapegoat. All of this will, of course, fuel that political narrative that I was just talking about. And I think from a public perception perspective, 2026 being kind of rough. Now, speaking of the 2028 presidential election, Even though next year is just the midterms, and even though you will likely not get most campaigns formally announced until after the midterms, I think as part of the whole data center politics, as well as AI layoffs conversation, you're going to start to see a lot of policies that would naturally fall out of the AI transition field tested as language in these campaigns. I think you're going to start to see more conversation about things like UBI. You're going to see more social safety net conversations. For the Democratic side of the aisle, who are already pro-safety net, this will be a little bit about figuring out which version of these things both makes the most sense to them as well as is the most politically palatable to independent and swing voters. Republicans and the right have a more interesting and challenging discovery process. It's very clear that the AI antagonist position will not just be the domain of the left, but will the right actually have an alternative solution, or will they focus on trying to stop AI in their tracks? What's more, how does the pro-tech versus the economic populist side of that party reconcile heading into the post-Trump era? Moving off of mainstream politics a little bit, I think we're going to see basically the equivalent of fair trade AI labels start to become a thing, particularly in the entertainment space. As much as many artists would like to put AI back in the box, there is a tension. Lots of creatives are using these tools and creating incredible things and getting excited about the possibilities. And even if they're not, there is a sense of inevitability here. So how do you resolve all that? The answer, of course, is some sort of ethical certification around how AI was trained or how AI is used. You're already starting to see this in Hollywood. Particularly, I'm thinking of Moon Valley, which promises AI video without the same ethics and copyright infringement concerns. And I think you're going to see more of this. Now, it won't be a straight line path. If you read the response to Moon Valley and Asteria and the artists and filmmakers who have chosen to go this path, it is still a tough road to hoe. You're taking on an additional burden and challenge and not using the state of the art, while also still having a big part of your industry treat you like a scab. But I think that in 2026, you're going to start to see these types of projects carve out an important space that creates a path forward that is neither rejectionism nor head in the sand ignoring the challenges. On the China side, as much as they're hemming and hawing about whether to accept H200s, I think China's going to accept the H200s. Now, it may be that the CCP completely controls the flow in and works really hard to create incentives for domestic chip manufacturing regardless, but I just don't see any way that they're going to deny themselves access to the most premium chips that they can get their hands on right now. That is unless Congress passes some limiting legislation on exports to China. This wouldn't surprise me. I could see this being a politically palatable way in the very short term to reject a specific Trump AI policy in a way that can be turned into a positive economic narrative for constituents. Now, we've already got some legislation in the works around this area that doesn't necessarily seem like it has huge momentum, but we're also in basically the quietest period of the congressional cycle. And so I would watch in January to see if that starts to pick up. Lastly, on the politics side, I think that the big bombastic policies like Bernie's data center moratorium doesn't really go anywhere. There's just too much against it. And I don't even necessarily think that Bernie thinks it's possible. I think that he's trying to shift the Overton window way back to the other side so that what does come out of it looks a lot closer to what he and the people who think like him want than it would have had he not proposed a dramatic policy like that. I think that the federal preemption that we got via executive order is going to be extremely difficult to put into practice. In fact, I think it's probably going to have the exact opposite effect, where basically states now have even more incentive to go pass AI rules as a way to assert their independence. Until you'll have a situation where all of these states are writing more rules and making headlines because of it, which my guess is actually shifts the balance a little bit among the AI lobby. And instead of enjoying the conspicuous lack of federal regulations, my guess is that you'll see the Washington offices of the big labs start to shift and support some basic national level rules. As much as we pretend there's not, there is a ton of space between the safetyist extremes on the one end and the accelerationist extremes on the other, where a huge mass of people can agree on some common sense starting points. And I would expect those not to necessarily be put into practice in 2026, but to start to see the labs actually support a version of them. So that is my AI predictions for 2026, with just one last one to go. I forgot to put this one in the list. It's probably the easiest one that I'll make. Both ChatGPT and Gemini will claim 1 billion active users in 2026. For ChatGPT, it'll be in Q1. For Gemini, I think it'll be in Q2, but it might be a little bit blurrier because of how distributed and all over the place Google's AI products are. But in either case, I think that in the first half of 2026, latest Q3 for Google, both of those companies and AI products will claim 1 billion users. So that is my list. Hopefully precise enough for you guys to have some debates about. And if you stuck with me through both of these episodes, you are a true AIG. For now, that is going to do it for today's episode. Appreciate you listening or watching. As always, Until next time, peace.